The letter came on a Tuesday, and it gave her one sunrise to do the impossible. Not a warning, not a request. An ending signed, stamped, delivered by a government that did not know her name beyond the filing number. She read it once, then again. Then she looked at the north fence line where 3/4 of a mile of open ground ran bare against the sky. The same open ground her husband had meant to close before the fever took him quiet in a February night 2 years gone. Thursday morning, the examiner rides up that lane, and either she has a fence or she does not have a home. One day, somewhere in this county, a man named Pruett was already calculating what her land would be worth once she was gone from it. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went to find a hand. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not a Tuesday with anything wrong with it. Not a Tuesday that in itself ifed with storm clouds, or bad omens, or the particular quality of light that sometimes warns a person. Just a Tuesday in September 1888. Dry and gold at the edges the way Modoc County mornings went in early fall, with the smell of sage and dust coming off the ridge and the cow needing milking, and the world not knowing or caring that everything was about to depend on the next 48 hours. Clara Bowen read it once standing at the kitchen table. Read it again sitting down. By the time she reached the last line she had it near to memorized, which was not a comfort. The land office at Alturas regretted to inform her that pursuant to a contest filed against her final proof, an examiner would call at the homestead on Thursday morning to inspect improvements as required under the Act. Failure to demonstrate cultivation, a habitable dwelling, and enclosure of the claimed acreage would result in the claim being declared abandoned and open to the contesting party. The contesting party was a man named Silas Pruett. Clara had never once seen Silas Pruett set foot on the land he claimed to be proving up. She was 38 years old, widowed 2 years come November, and she had exactly 1 day left to finish 4 days' worth of fence. The table under her hands was pine, worn smooth at the center where 2 people had eaten 10 years of meals. One corner had letters scratched into the wood with a pocket knife, T and C, and the year 1874, cut careful and deliberate the way Thomas had done everything, as if the world would hold still long enough for a man to mean it. Every morning when Clara wiped the table down, her hand moved around that corner without her deciding to. A small orbit, unconscious as breathing. She had noticed it once, maybe 8 months after he was gone. Would you treat them with kindness? And had stood there with a cloth in her hand for longer than she could account for, then kept wiping. She did not look at it now. She looked at the letter. 3/4 of a mile of fence line running bare along the north boundary, where Thomas had meant to string wire the spring, before the fever took him quiet in his sleep one February night. The barn roof still wanted its final course of cedar shakes. The northeast corner of the cultivated ground, the corner that sat you with kindness, that sat visible from the road and would therefore be the first thing an examiner walking the perimeter would reach, had gone to cheatgrass the summer. She could not manage both the plow and the cow, and had chosen the cow because a person needs milk more than a field needs perfection. One day, she had one. She had posted the notice in the Modoc County paper 3 weeks earlier, written out in her own hand and carried to the Cedarville post office by Ruth Alcott, who was going to town anyway, and had stood at the counter while Clara filled out the form and had not said anything but had pressed her lips together in the particular way Ruth had. That meant she was thinking 3 things at once and choosing to say none of them. One hand wanted steady work, $30 a month and board, Whitmore Place, Juniper Ridge. Clara had not pictured anyone specific when she wrote it. She had pictured the work, the wire unspooled, and the posts set, and the cheatgrass turned under, and the shakes laid, and the whole thing done before Thursday morning, so that when the examiner rode up the lane he would see what 5 years of proving up looked like when it was finished. She had pictured that. She had not quite believed it, but she had pictured it. Nobody came. 3 weeks and nobody came. She folded them, kindness. She folded the letter and put it in the tin box under the false bottom of the bureau drawer, where she kept the original filing papers and Thomas's death certificate and the single photograph taken of the 2 of them in Alturas the year they filed. Thomas in his good coat, looking like he was trying not to smile and failing. Clara in her gray dress, looking like she was trying to smile and failing, and both of them slightly blurred because neither one had been able to hold perfectly still. She went out to milk the cow. The cow's name was not anything. Thomas had said early on that naming a working animal was a way of making yourself feel something you could not afford to feel. And Clara had agreed, and then had treated them with kindness, and then had spent years talking to the animal in a low, continuous voice, the way she talked to the plants in the kitchen garden when she thought nobody was listening. Not naming was one thing, not talking was another. The morning was cold the way September mornings went cold on Juniper Ridge, which was the cold of elevation and open sky, and not yet the cold of real winter, which would come in November and stay until April, and not apologize for either arrival or departure. Clara sat on the milking stool in the gray flannel dress she wore for barn work, the hem already dark at the knee from the damp of the straw, her hands moving in the familiar pull and release that she could have done asleep or in the dark, which she had occasionally done both. She was thinking about the northeast corner. If she started at first light and worked through until the light gave out, she could turn the cheatgrass under on her own. The ground was hard. Hard ground and one woman and a mattock was not a combination that arrived at anything fast. But she could get the top growth cut, the root systems broken, and if she seeded it before dark, there would at least be evidence of intention when the examiner came. Whether intention was enough was a different question, and she knew the answer and set it aside. The fence was the real problem. 3/4 of a mile of fence was 4 men 2 days of work, or 8 men 1 day. It was not one woman any number of days, not with the posts to set, and the wire to stretch and the corner bracing to build. She knew this. Would you treat them with kindness? She had known it since Thomas died and left the north line open, had known it through 2 full years of looking at the problem and moving around it the way her hand moved around the corner of the table, present to it, unable to solve it, present to it anyway. Ruth Alcott arrived at 7:30, which was early even for Ruth, who kept her own hours and had, since her husband Gaines had died 15 years ago and left her the 40 acres east of the Ridge Road, and the thorough understanding that nobody was going to tell her when to come and go. Ruth was 60 years old and did not look it and did not act it, and would have said, if asked, that 60 was a number that applied to some people and not to others, and that she had not yet determined which category was hers. She wore a gray wool skirt and a cream cotton blouse under a heavy wool shawl, and her bonnet sat on the back of her head at the angle of a woman who had put it on because the sun required it, and then immediately forgotten it was there. She drove a 2-wheeled buggy behind a bay mare named Clover, who had opinions about everything and communicated them through her ears. She climbed down from the buggy with the ease of a woman who had been climbing in and out of buggies for 40 years, tied Clover to the post by the gate, and came across the yard carrying a folded newspaper page and a look that Clara had learned to read as preparation. Ruth Alcott came prepared to things. It was one of the 2 or 3 most reliable facts about her. I brought you something. She held out the folded page. I should have brought it sooner. I told myself you already knew, and then I'd decided that was a story I was telling myself, because bringing it was uncomfortable, and I am too old for comfortable. Clara took the page. It was from the Alturas paper, dated 18 months back, and there was a paragraph underlined in pencil in Ruth's hand. The paragraph said that Mr. Silas Pruett, land agent, had completed the conveyance of 3 claims in the Butte Valley area to the Cascade Cattlemen's Association for a sum that the paper described as substantial, without specifying what substantial meant. The rest of the article was about something else entirely. Clara read it once. Read it again. He sells the relinquishments. He sells them before the 5 years are up, which means he needs someone else to prove the improvements. First, because the association will not pay for land that cannot pass inspection. Ruth's voice was level in the way of a woman who has had the conversation she is preparing to have several times already in her own head. He files a contest when someone else's claim looks close to done. If the contest scares them off, he takes the land cheap. If they fight it, he bogs them down in the process until they run out of money or time. Either way, he ends up with improved land he never worked a day on. How many times has he done it? In Modoc County alone, the number I have been able to put together is 19. 19. Clara looked at the number the same way she had looked at the fence problem. Present to it, unable to make it smaller by looking. He does not want this land, she said. Not a question. Not quite. He wants the corridor, Ruth said. The Cascade Association has been trying to establish a grazing route from the eastern plateau to the Winter Range down by the river for 3 years. Your North Line and the Polson Place and the 2 parcels east of the Creek Road are all that stand between open range and a straight shot through. If Pruett can clear this stretch, the association pays him very well. Clara refolded the newspaper page with the care of someone handling something that matters. Why are you telling me this now? Ruth looked at her straight, the way Ruth did everything straight. Because this morning I drove past your north fence line on the way here, and I counted what was standing and what was not standing, and I decided you needed to know what you are actually up against before Thursday. I already know what I am up against. You know about the examiner and the fence. I wanted you to know about the 19. Clara put the newspaper page in her apron pocket. The apron was blue cotton, faded at the pockets from washing, with a small mend at the left hem where she had caught it on a nail the previous spring. She wore it over a brown wool dress with buttons up to the collar and long sleeves pushed to the elbow for barn work. Her hair was brown going to gray at the temples, pinned back with a bone comb that had been her mother's, and she wore low leather boots tied with rawhide lace because the buckle on the right boot had broken in June, and she had not yet gotten to Cedarville to replace it. She was not a woman who looked at herself much. She knew what she looked like. She looked like a woman who had been working hard land for 10 years, which was exactly what she was. Would you treat them with kindness? And she had decided somewhere in the first year after Thomas died that this was something she could either fight or inhabit, and she had chosen to inhabit it, and she had not regretted the choice on any day when there was work to be done, which was all of them. Stay for coffee, she said to Ruth. I can't stay long. I have to get back before the Hennessy boy comes to look at the fence post situation on my east line. Ruth followed her toward the house anyway, which was what staying long looked like for Ruth Alcott. They were drinking coffee at the kitchen table when they heard the wagon. Clara heard it first. The sound of iron wheel rims on the dry dirt of the lane, which had a particular rattle depending on how loaded the wagon was. And this wagon was loaded. She could hear the weight in the sound of it, the slow, deliberate pace of horses pulling something heavy. She set her coffee cup down, looked at Ruth. Ruth's expression said she was listening too. Clara stood up, pushed her chair back, and went to the door. The wagon was a spring wagon, the kind built for moving things rather than carrying people, with high wooden sides and a canvas cover lashed over the bed. It was pulled by 2 horses that did not match, a chestnut with a white blaze and a gray that was closer to silver. Would you treat them with kindness? And they were being driven by a man on the bench seat who was handling the reins with the loose competence of someone who had been handling reins for a long time and had stopped thinking about it the way Clara had stopped thinking about milking. He pulled the horses up in the yard, set the brake, and climbed down with kindness from the bench with the careful deliberateness of a man whose back had opinions about climbing down from wagon benches. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was not the movement of an old man, but of a man who had put in enough years of work that his body had started keeping a tally. He was broad through the shoulders and lean in the way of work rather than shortage, wearing a blue flannel shirt that had been washed so many times. The color had retreated toward gray, canvas trousers the color of creek mud, and heavy leather boots that had seen enough miles to have earned whatever condition they were in. His belt was wide dark leather, plain, without ornament. His hat was a Stetson with a wide brim, brown, pushed down against the morning light. He walked toward her and took the hat off before he had covered half the distance, held it at his side. Holt Granger. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent enough time outdoors that it had dried out a little, gone a few degrees west of soft without arriving at hard. I am here about the notice for a hand. Clara looked at him, looked at the wagon, looked at the canvas over the wagon bed. And then the canvas moved. Would you treat them with kindness? It moved at 3 places at once and then more places, and 8 men climbed out of the wagon bed with the efficiency of people who had climbed out of wagon beds many times before and knew how to do it without getting in each other's way. The tallest came over the side first with his hand already on the axe handle sticking up from the load. Then the next. Then the next. The last one over was the largest, broad-shouldered and deliberate. And when he dropped to the ground, Clara saw that both his hands from the knuckles to the wrist were wrapped in white cloth bandaging. She counted. Could not help it. 1, 2, 3, 8, 9, counting Holt Granger. The notice said 1 hand, she said. The words came out level. She had not decided to say them level. It was just what happened. It did. Holt Granger was not apologetic, not defensive. The way he said, it was the way a man stated a fact that he had already made his peace with. I am the 1 hand. These are my brothers and cousins. They eat whether they are working or standing still, and they do not eat less for being idle. A man who hires me gets 9 for the cost of 1, which is the price of their supper. He looked past her. She knew what he was looking at. The gap in the fence line on the north ridge was visible from the yard on a clear morning, which this was. He was reading it the way men who knew land read land. Not like looking at a view, but like reading a ledger. Ma'am, if you will let me say it plain, you have got a day's worth of trouble, and about 1 day left to answer it. Clara Bowen had not cried in front of a stranger since the morning they buried Thomas in the ground that was not yet legally hers to bury him in. She did not cry now. Would you treat them with kindness? But she stood in her own dooryard at 6 in the morning, with the examiner's letter folded in the tin box in the drawer, and the newspaper page in her apron pocket, and 9 men looking at her homestead with the particular attention of people who were already calculating what it would take, and something happened in the center of her chest that she had not felt in 2 years. Something that had been banked low and quiet startled, the way a stove catches after a long cold night, and she had to look at the fence line for a moment instead of at him. I cannot pay 9 wages, she said. I did not ask for 9 wages. Still not apologetic. Not anything except matter of fact. I asked for 1 day. Point us at the fence. She pointed north. Ruth Alcott was standing in the doorway of the kitchen behind her. Clara did not turn to look at her. She did not need to. Would you treat them with kindness? She knew Ruth's expression would be the expression of a woman who had driven past the north fence line that morning and done the arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion that had just shown up in the yard with a wagon. The men spread out before Clara had finished pointing. Not scattered, not random, but distributed, the way a hand of cards lands on a table, each one going to a place as though the place had already been assigned. Would you treat them with kindness? The tallest, who was introduced as Aaron and who looked about 24 with the shoulders of someone who had been lifting a man's weight since he was 16, went to the wagon and pulled the post-hole auger out of the bed with a single-handed ease that made the implement look lighter than it was. He was wearing a brown canvas coat over a heavy cotton work shirt, and he set off north across the yard without breaking stride. The second one, Roy, had wire-working hands. Clara could see it in the way his fingers moved around the first coil of barbed wire he lifted from the wagon, the particular sureness of muscle memory. He wore a dark wool shirt with the cuffs turned back and canvas trousers held up by leather suspenders, and he moved the wire with the efficiency of someone who had spliced and strung enough of it that the work had stopped being work and become something closer to habit. Frank was the one who started on the water situation before anyone asked him to. He found the well, found the buckets, found the spacing between the work sites. Would you treat them with kindness, and began moving between them with a quiet purposefulness that suggested he had always been the one who thought about water. His hat was black, sweat-stained at the band, and he wore it pulled low on the right side against the morning sun in the east. There were more. Clara did not catch all the names in the first minutes because there were too many of them, and she was still adjusting to the fact of them, to the sound of her yard full of purpose for the first time in 2 years. She would learn the names. She had time for that. What she did not have time for was standing in the yard looking at it. Would you treat them with kindness? The last man off the wagon was the large one with the wrapped hands. He dropped to the ground, steadied himself, and stood for a moment looking at the farm with the quiet attention of someone taking inventory. He was 34 or so, with a broad face and eyes that were a very pale gray. Would you treat them with kindness? And the stillness of his expression was not the stillness of a man who had nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who had learned to hold what he had to say somewhere below the surface, where it could not be taken from him. Would you treat them with kindness? He walked toward the fence by the coop and sat down on an overturned barrel, and Clara watched him take a length of rope from his coat pocket, with hands that moved from the wrist rather than the fingers, working the rope around two fixed points, and beginning to tie something complicated with the particular patience of a man relearning emotion from the outside in. She went over to him. She did not plan to. Her feet went. Holt Granger. He did not look up from the rope. I know what you are looking at. I am not looking at anything. He looked up then. The pale gray eyes were level and without apology. Last April, Coyote Gulch Mine up in Shasta County. 8 men went in. 6 came out. I was one of the 6. Clara did not say she was sorry. She had heard enough sorry in the 2 years since Thomas died to know that it was what people said when they did not know what else to say and did not want to say nothing. She waited. I held the last support timber long enough for 2 more men to crawl out, Cord said. He looked back at the rope. The doctor said I was fortunate to keep the use of them at all. I think about that some days more than others. Why did you come? Clara said. Not unkindly. Simply, because Holt is my brother, Cord said, and the people of mine need to be where the people of mine are. He went back to the rope. Would you treat them with kindness? She went back to the yard. Holt Granger was standing at the corner of the barn, looking at the roof when she came around. He had his hat back on, and one hand shading his eyes against the climbing sun, reading the slope of the roof the way he had read the fence line, with the particular attention of a man calculating what was needed and whether it was possible. The northeast corner of the shakes is the gap, Clara said, coming up beside him. She did not plan that either. Would you treat them? She seemed to be operating on the instinct of the moment rather than anything premeditated, which was a condition she associated with the first year after Thomas died. Would you treat them with kindness? When she had stopped planning things more than an hour ahead, because planning things more than an hour ahead had started to seem like a presumption. I see it. He dropped his hand, looked at her instead of the roof. Your northeast corner of cultivated ground is where the cheatgrass is. Yes. Visible from the road, yes. That is what the examiner will walk to first, not a question. A man who had been around enough land inspections to know how they went. I know, Clara said. When did it go? The summer of 1887. I could not keep up with both the plow and the milking that season, and I chose the milking. He nodded once. Not judgment. Would you treat them with kindness? Just the acknowledgement of a man who understood that a person working alone has to make choices, and that making the wrong choice is not the same as making a bad choice when the options were what they were. Who was your husband? He said. Not prying. The tone of it was the tone of a man who asked direct questions, because indirect questions wasted time that could be spent on other things. Thomas Bowen. He died February of 1886. Fever. 3 years shy of the end of the proving period. She said it the way she always said it, which was the way you said a thing when you had said it enough times that the words had become the shape of the truth, rather than the truth itself. Plain. Accurate. Not inviting elaboration. Holt Granger looked at the roof again. My wife died in the fall of 1882, bringing the youngest into the world. He said it the same way. Plain. Accurate. Something that had been lived through and set down, not picked up and examined regularly but not buried either. Just there, I have been moving since, taking work where it is, doing what can be done. You have no land. Clara said it, and then was aware that it was the sort of observation that could read as impertinent. She did not take it back. It had not been impertinent. It had been direct, which was the other thing you were when indirect questions wasted time. Not yet. The 2 words carried something heavier than their literal weight, he said. Yet the way a man said a word he had been keeping in his mouth for a long time, worn smooth from handling. Clara heard it, did not comment on it, filed it. Come inside, she said. "There is coffee, and I want to look at what supplies you brought before I decide what to take on myself and what to leave to your people." He followed her into the kitchen. He took his hat off at the door, without being asked, which was the gesture of a man who had been raised with certain habits and had kept them regardless of how useful they were in any given practical situation. He sat down in the chair on the far side of the table, the chair that had been Thomas's chair, and that Clara still sometimes did not look directly. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And he put his hat on his knee and looked around the kitchen with the calm, comprehensive interest of a man assessing a place without assessing it, the way people who have lived in many places carry with them a habit of reading rooms. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the wood stove and set one in front of him, and sat down across the table. "The corner bracing on the northeast post position will need to be double set," she said. Thomas always double set the corners on ground that went hard in summer. "The north ridge dries out by July and does not come back until the rains. I will have Aaron do it." He drank the coffee, not quickly, with the considered pace of a man who treated the first coffee of the morning as something that had been earned and deserved to be received accordingly. "How far does the hard ground run?" "From the creek crossing to the second rise, maybe 600 yards. After the second rise it softens. There was a spring there once, fed the water table. It has not been running for 8 or 9 years, but the ground remembers." He looked at her over the coffee cup, not with surprise, with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You know this land. I have been on it since I was 22. She said it flatly, not proudly, the way you stated a duration that had become simply the measurement of how long things had been what they were. "I came here as a bride following Thomas, on the promise of good grass and better water, and both of those things turned out to be true enough to make the rest of it survivable. The rest of it." She looked at him. "The rest of it is the part that is not good grass and better water, which is most of it." He almost smiled. She saw it not quite happen at the corner of his mouth, the controlled beginning of something that he pulled back before it arrived. She did not know why he pulled it back. She noted that he did. "The Pruett matter," he said. The change of subject was not abrupt. "Would you treat them with kindness?" It was the way a conversation shifted when a man decided something needed to be said and decided not to make a production of deciding it. "Tell me what you know." Clara told him. She told him about the letter. She told him about the notice she had posted and the 3 weeks of no response. She told him about Ruth Alcott and the newspaper page and the 19 claims and the Cascade Cattlemen's Association and the corridor along the north side of Juniper Ridge that Pruett was clearing for them, one family at a time. Holt Granger listened without interrupting. He listened the way Clara had come to understand in the 2 years since Thomas died that not many people listened, which was without preparing his own response whilst she was still talking. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Without shaping his expressions meant to signal that he was listening, simply receiving what she said and letting it settle. "He will contest regardless of whether the examiner approves the improvements," he said when she was finished. "The contest is already filed. The examiner can approve or not approve. What matters is what is on the ground when he arrives. I know. Then we need to be done before dark." He stood up, picked up his hat, put it on. "I would like to start on the east side of the fence gap and work west, because the wind comes from the northwest in the afternoon on high ground like this, and a man stringing wire wants the wind behind him, not in his face. Unless you know something about that ridge that changes it." Clara thought about it honestly rather than reflexively. September. The wind shifts northeast by 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Not always, but usually. He recalculated without showing the calculation. "Then we start northwest and work east." He moved toward the door. "What are you taking on yourself?" "The corner. I will turn the cheatgrass." He paused at the door, looked back at her. There was something in his expression that she could not immediately name, which was unusual because she was generally good at naming what she saw in people's expressions. It was not pity. It was not admiration either. Would you treat them with kindness? It was closer to the expression you would have if you had been doing a difficult thing alone for a long time, and then watched someone else begin to do a different difficult thing alone, and recognized in the beginning of it something you knew well enough to respect without needing to be told to. "Leave the hard northeast section until one of us is free," he said. "The southwest corner you can manage. The northeast is where the examiner looks first, and it needs to be right." "I know which corner the examiner looks at first," Clara said. He did not apologize. He went out the door. Clara stood at the kitchen table for a moment after he had gone. The coffee cups were still there, the newspaper page in her apron pocket, the corner of the table with T and C and 1874. Outside she could hear the sound of the wagon being unloaded, the clink of wire coils and the knock of tool handles, and voices in the low coordinated shorthand of men who had worked together long enough to have developed a shared language below the level of words. She went out. The morning had opened up by now, the flat golden early light giving way to the higher broader light of mid-morning, and the shadows of the cottonwood trees in the yard lay long and irregular across the dry ground. Clara crossed the yard to the barn, went through the side door, and found the mattock hanging on the wall between the hoe and the post tamper. It had been Thomas's mattock, heavier than the one she usually worked with, the handle worn smooth at the grip from years of his hands, and when she lifted it from the nail, it had a balance that felt familiar in an unfamiliar way, the memory in her hands of watching someone else use it, rather than the memory of using it herself. She carried it out the east door of the barn and walked northeast toward the corner of the cultivated ground. Ruth Alcott was still in the yard. She had not left in the time between. She was standing near her buggy talking to Holt Granger, who was still on the barrel by the fence. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And from a distance Clara could not hear the conversation, but she could see that Ruth was talking with her hands the way Ruth did when she was explaining something she considered important, and that Holt Granger was listening with the same completeness she had seen in his brother. Clara turned northeast and walked. The cheatgrass corner was 60 yards from the barn door, and up close it was worse than it looked from a distance, which was usually the way with the things you had been putting off looking at directly. The grass was high and dry, the seed heads already dropped, the stems gone woody at the base, and the root system would be deep and horizontal and resistant. She knew this grass. It had come in behind a wet spring 2 years ago, and she had gotten most of it and missed this corner. Because that was the year she had also been managing Thomas's grave and the filing paperwork and the first full summer alone, and missing one corner of the field in that year had not been a failure. It had been the best she could do. She swung the mattock. The ground gave reluctantly. The first dozen strokes produced more noise than progress, the mattock bouncing off the dry clay, with a shock that went up her arms to the shoulder and made her adjust her grip and her stance. And then she found the angle and the rhythm, and the ground began to open up, the root mass coming apart in sections that kicked to the side before moving forward another foot. She had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard someone behind her and turned to find Roy Granger walking toward her with a second mattock over one shoulder. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the cheatgrass, reading it the same way Holt had read the roof and fence line. And when he reached her, he set the mattock against his hip and looked at the section she had already turned. "You are going at the angle," he said. Not criticism, the tone of a man offering information. "I know the angle," Clara said. "I can see that you do." He looked at the roots she had cleared. "I am not arguing with your angle. I am saying the ground in the next section runs different. The clay pan tilts the other way. I can see it from the color change." Clara looked. He was right. The surface soil about 15 feet. The surface soil about 15 feet ahead, darker at the edge, which meant the drainage pattern shifted and the clay compaction beneath it would be oriented differently. "Work from the east edge," she said. "I will come at it from the west." He went east. She went back to work. "Would you treat them with kindness?" By the time she had reached the midpoint of the corner section, the sun had climbed enough to put genuine heat on her back through the wool of her dress. "Would you treat them with kindness?" And she had pushed the long sleeves up past the elbow and tucked the skirt hem through her apron strings to keep it out of the way of the mattock swing. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Her hair had come partly loose from the bone comb, and she had pushed it back with the back of her wrist twice without bothering to pin it again. She was not thinking about what she looked like. Would you treat them with kindness? She was thinking about the root systems and the angle of the clay and the fact that by midday they would have this section turned if Roy Granger's pace was what it looked like it was going to be. She was also thinking about the 19. Not about the details of the scheme in the way she had turned them over in the first hour after Ruth brought the paper, but about the shape of it. 19 families. 19 claims, meaning somewhere between 30 and 150 people who had come to this country, the same way she and Thomas had come, with the promise of land that could become theirs, if they put in the time and the work and the 5 years. 19 times Pruett had stood between those people and the deed that was the point of all of it. He had not taken the land with violence or with raw dishonesty. Not exactly, because on paper it was a legal process, a contest, a formal dispute, the machinery of the system doing what it was built to do. He had just figured out how to put himself inside the machinery and use it. She set the mattock down and used the flat of it to break up the root sections she had turned, and the motion was harder than swinging, requiring a different engagement of the shoulders. Would you treat them with kindness? And she was aware of a line of fatigue building across the top of her back that would be worse. There would be a tomorrow in which her claim was still hers. She had to believe that in order to function, and she did believe it, but she was aware of the difference between belief and knowledge, and she held the belief carefully, the way you held a lamp in wind. The newspaper page in her apron pocket crinkled when she moved. Not just her land. That was what Ruth had been saying. Underneath the information, which was what Ruth did. Put the important thing underneath the information and let you arrive at it yourself. Not just Clara's claim. If Pruett cleared this stretch of the ridge, the corridor opened. If the corridor opened, the Cascade Association moved their herds through without fence line to stop them, which meant the grass on every homestead along the North Run got eaten down to dirt by cattle belonging to no one who lived there, which meant the families who came after her, who had not filed yet, or were still in their first or second year of proving up, came to land that was no longer the land they had been promised. She swung the mattock. She was not going to let that happen. She had not decided this in any single clear moment. It was just a thing she knew. Solid in the way that very simple things become solid when a person has been made to look at them directly. Thomas was in the ground on this land. She had put 5 years of mornings and seasons and work into this land. Would you treat them with kindness? The northeast corner was going to be turned and seeded by dark, and the north fence was going to run corner to corner, and the mended section of shakes on the barn roof was going to be laying tight before the examiner rode up the lane on Thursday morning. Roy Granger was 6 feet away working east to west, and his mattock was making the same sound as hers, the rhythmic knock of iron on hard ground. And she found that she had unconsciously matched her swing to his, the two of them working in a rhythm they had not discussed and did not need to. Would you treat them with kindness? She did not look up when she heard Ruth's buggy on the lane around 11, and she did not stop working when she heard Ruth's voice in the yard and the voices of the men coming in for the midday break. Roy set his mattock down and looked at the section they had completed and looked at the section remaining. And what she saw in his face was the satisfaction of a man who had done honest work and could see what he had done, which was its own vocabulary, readable to anyone who had ever done honest work themselves. 2 more hours after dinner, he said. 90 minutes, Clara said. I want the seed in before the afternoon wind. He picked up his mattock. 90 minutes. They walked back toward the cottonwood trees, where Ruth Alcott was laying out a spread of food on 2 canvas tops, with the competent authority of a woman who had been feeding groups of working people for 40 years and had developed strong views about the correct way to do it. She had brought a pot of white beans slow-cooked since morning, and a cloth-wrapped stack of cornbread, and Clara had brought out the ham she had been saving. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at the ham for one moment before she set it down, aware that she had been saving it for a better occasion than this, and aware simultaneously that she could not think of a better occasion than this, and then she set it down and began slicing. Holt Granger came in from the north line with his coat off and his flannel shirt, dark at the shoulders with sweat, and his hat pushed back on his head, and he washed his hands at the pump, and sat down cross-legged on the edge of the tarp, without ceremony. He looked at the food, and then at the progress visible from where he sat, the fence posts along the north line that had not been there this morning, and he looked at Clara with an expression that she still could not quite name. "You have been working the corner," he said. "Roy helped. Roy helps." He said it simply, as if it were one of the most reliable facts he knew, which Clara thought it probably was. She cut him a piece of ham and put it on a plate and handed it across, and he took it with a nod that meant thank you without being thank you. The compressed acknowledgement of a man who understood that in certain situations, the full version of a thing took more time than the situation allowed. The yard was full of sound. Would you treat them with kindness? The sound of men eating and talking in the low register of people who are comfortable with each other. The sound of Ruth Alcott's voice carrying over the others the way Ruth's voice always carried. The specific sound of 9 people existing in a space that had been one person's space for 2 years. Clara sat on the edge of the second tarp with her plate and listened to it. It sounded like something that had been missing. She had not known it was missing. Because when something is gone, long enough you stop hearing the absence the way you stop hearing the silence after a clock stops, and then when the clock starts again you realize the silence had been there all along. Ruth sat down beside her with her own plate and her own coffee, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had observed more than she was going to say. "Well," Ruth said. "Do not," Clara said. "I was not going to say anything. You were about to say something." "I was about to say that sometimes things happen the way they should happen," Ruth said. "That is all. It is a simple observation." "It is not a simple observation." "No," Ruth agreed, "but it is a true one." Clara looked at the north fence line, at the posts that had not been there this morning, at Holt Granger on his barrel by the coop, eating with a fork held against his palm, unhurried. At Holt Granger across the top, his hat on his knee again, listening to something Roy was saying with the half-attention of a man who is listening to one thing while thinking about another. "There is still the examiner," she said. "Yes," Ruth said. "There is still the examiner. And still Pruett." "Yes. And still the fact that a day's work, however well done, is not 3 years of cultivation." "No," Ruth said. "It is not." Clara drank her coffee. "Then we had better get back to it." She stood up, picked up her mattock, and walked back toward the northeast corner. Behind her she heard Roy Granger set down his plate and stand up. She did not turn around. She did not need to. She could hear him following. The particular sound of leather boots on hard ground, and the sound of it was steadier than she expected. And she walked north into the light of the September morning, with the cheatgrass waiting, and the fence line half done, and the examiner coming on Thursday, and everything still entirely to be decided. She swung the mattock. The ground opened. Roy Granger worked the way water moves downhill. Not fast, not slow. Just inevitable, following the path of least resistance, except that in Roy's case the path was wherever the work was hardest. And he moved toward hard work the way water moves toward low ground, without apparent decision, without ceremony, simply arriving where the gravity of necessity pointed. Clara noticed this in the first 20 minutes after they returned from the midday meal and filed it away alongside the other things she was noticing. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was that she had developed in the last 6 hours the habit of noticing things about these men, with the same attention she had previously reserved for weather and ground conditions. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of attention that a person develops when information about their surroundings has become survival relevant. The northeast corner of the cultivated ground took 94 minutes, not 90. Clara did not begrudge the extra 4 minutes. Would you treat them with kindness? When the last root section came apart under the mattock and Roy turned the broken clods with the flat of the blade, and she could see from the surface texture that they had reached consistent depth across the full section, something released in her chest that she had not known was held. The corner was ready. Whatever it was not, it was no longer cheatgrass. She went to the barn for the seed sack while Roy carried the mattocks back. The seed was winter rye, kept in a cloth sack hung from the ceiling hook to keep it off the damp floor, and she lifted it down and tested the weight and calculated the section, and walked back with the sack over her shoulder, and began broadcasting by hand in the long sweeping motion. Thomas had shown her in the second year, moving backward across the tilled ground, so she did not step on what she had seeded. She did not look up while she seeded. She was aware of the sounds around her. The fence, this work on the north line moving forward in the sound of the auger and the wire stretcher, and the occasional directed word between the men working it. The soft percussion of Frank, moving between the well and the various positions with water. The sound of the barn above her, where someone, she thought Aaron, was working the shake problem on the roof. She was aware of all of this the way a person is aware of weather when they are working outdoors, as a condition of the environment, rather than a thing to be examined. And she was aware, below all of it, of the direction of the afternoon, and the hours remaining before dark. The wind shifted northeast at 2:10, which was earlier than she had predicted, and was another piece of ground truth that she noted without emotion. Holt Granger was right to recalculate toward east when she told him September wind went northeast. Would you treat them with kindness? He had recalculated faster than she had given him the information, which meant he had already been considering the possibility before she confirmed it. That was the behavior of a man who was running his own calculations, alongside whoever he was talking to, which was either a compliment to her or simply the habit of someone who had been working outdoors in variable conditions long enough to build in a margin for what he did not yet know. She finished the seeding and tied off the sack and carried it back to the barn. When she came out of the barn, Holt was standing at the northeast corner of the cultivated ground looking at what she had done. He had his coat back on against the wind, the canvas duster he wore over the flannel shirt in the afternoon cold that came off the ridge when the sun dropped below the tree line. He was looking at the seeded section the way he looked at everything, which was to say fully, not glancing. His hat cast a shadow across the upper half of his face, and she could read the lower half, the set of his jaw, and what she read there was not assessment so much as recognition. She came and stood beside him. "It will not look like much Thursday morning," he said. It was not a concession. It was information. "No," Clara agreed. "But Examiner Taft has been doing this work for 22 years. He knows what fresh tilled ground looks like, and he knows what abandoned ground looks like, and they do not look the same even at one day's distance. You know him. I know of him. Ruth Alcott knows a woman in Cedarville whose husband has had 2 inspections, one by Taft and one by the previous examiner. She says, Taft is a man who reads land rather than paperwork." Holt looked at the corner for another moment, then let him read it. He turned and walked back toward the north line. Clara followed because the north line was where the remaining work was, and she intended to be part of whatever remained to be done. Would you treat them with kindness? She had established this as a fact of her own behavior by going to the corner with the mattock that morning, and she was not going to reverse it by standing in the yard watching the afternoon happen. Would you treat them with kindness? The north fence line had transformed in a way that struck her each time she looked at it with something between disbelief and a more complicated emotion she did not have a ready name for. 40 posts stood where there had been open ground in the morning, set at intervals of 8 feet, double-braced at the corners and single-braced at intermediate tensions, and 3 strands of wire ran taut between them, the wire catching the afternoon sun at angles that made it intermittently visible, lines of light drawn across the landscape. There was still perhaps 200 yards left to close the western end of the gap where the ground ran softer, and the posts would go easier, but the distance was what it was. Aaron was on the north end, augering the last of the post holes with his coat off, despite the wind, his canvas suspenders over the work shirt, dark with sweat in a V from the collar down, moving the auger with a mechanical steadiness that Clara had given up trying to match with any single comparative image. He was simply exceptionally good at augering post holes, the way certain people are exceptionally good at one specific physical task, and watching him do it was like watching water find its level, natural and unremarkable, and also somehow clarifying about the nature of skilled work. Roy was stringing wire behind Aaron, working the stretcher with Jesse, who was the quieter of the two, and moved with the economy of someone who had learned that efficiency in physical work was not about moving less, but about never moving the wrong thing. Would you treat them with kindness? Jesse wore a brown and a gray hat, and he worked the wire with a focus that had something monastic about it. Complete attention to the task in the way of a person for whom the task is sufficient. Cord was still at the fence line of the coop, but he was no longer on the barrel. He was standing at the post, and he had a length of wire in his wrapped hands, and he was working it around the post with technique Clara had not seen before, using his wrists as pivots and his forearms as leverage. Turning the wrapped cloth against the wire generated the friction he could not get from grip. His face showed the concentration of a man solving a specific problem, rather than performing a learned skill, working out as he went. She watched him for a moment from 20 yards away. He caught her watching and looked back at her without self-consciousness or defensiveness, just the direct acknowledgement of someone seen doing what they were doing. She nodded. He turned back to the wire. Frank was at the wagon, reorganizing what remained in the bed with the systematic care of a man who had learned that the last hour of work always required tools that were at the bottom of whatever you had stacked everything else on top of. Would you treat them with kindness? He wore a heavy wool coat over his work shirt in the afternoon cold and moved the equipment with the practiced ease of a man who considered this kind of organizing to be as much his work as the carrying would be. Holt went to the wire, took the stretcher from Jesse in exchange for something said in a low voice Clara did not catch, and Jesse went back to threading wire through the U-staples on the posts that Aaron had already set. Clara went to the wagon and took out the remaining coil of wire that Frank had moved to the top, which was either fortunate or deliberate, and she suspected the latter, and carried it to Roy, who took it from her, with a nod that was the same currency as Holt's nod at the table. Compressed acknowledgement. The same transactional vocabulary used by people who understood that certain things than certains needed to happen faster than language could manage. She worked the afternoon, not alongside the men in the sense of doing the same tasks, because the wire work required a specific learned efficiency that she had not had reason to develop alone, but in parallel, carrying, stacking the cut posts that were not needed, clearing the coil wire away from underfoot as it was used. Would you treat them with kindness? Doing the continuous background maintenance of a construction site that was necessary and invisible, and without which the visible work slowed. It was the work that a person did when they knew a site well enough to anticipate what it needed before it needed it. And she knew this land well enough to do it, and she did it. Ruth Alcott came out of the house at 3, with a water bucket and a dipper, and went down the line without being asked, offering water to each man in the order she encountered them, and the order she encountered them was the order in which they were working, which meant she had looked at the site from the porch and mapped it before she walked out. Clara watched this from 60 yards away, and felt something that was not quite admiration and not quite gratitude, but was adjacent to both, the recognition of a person being competent in a way that was easy to overlook because it did not require tools. It was Roy who called it first. Or not called it, because Roy was not a man who called things. He stopped, looked up from the wire he was threading, looked south across the road. Clara saw him look and followed his line of sight. The smoke was visible, above the ridge south of the county road, a column that was moving with the wind, which meant it was not a controlled burn. Controlled burns in September on the ridge were banked things, low to the ground, producing the flat gray haze of damp material smoldering rather than the climbing white and gray billow that this was. This was dry grass burning upright and fast, driven by the northeast wind that had shifted an hour earlier. Holt was looking at it by the time Clara had processed what she was seeing. He had been looking at it for several seconds already. His expression was not alarm, exactly. It was the expression of a man rapidly calculating a significant number of variables and producing a result he did not like. That is south of the road, he said. Not a question. Checking his own spatial orientation. 2 miles south, maybe less. Clara was looking at the smoke column and estimating. The wind is northeast at maybe 15 miles. The grass on that south ridge is dry. It has been dry since August. Whose land? She said it flatly. The way you said a thing that had an obvious implication, and you wanted to be clear you had not missed the implication. That is the Pruett claim. Nobody said anything for 3 full seconds. Holt looked at the smoke. Frank had come around the wagon and was looking at it. Aaron had stopped auguring and was looking at it. Roy was looking at it. Cord had come around the corner of the coop and was looking at it. Holt looked away from the smoke and at Clara. Fire does not read land office filings. He said it simply, which was the way he seemed to say the things he had thought through to the end before he said them. It does not ask permission, and it does not check whose name is on the claim before it moves. No, Clara said. It does not. If that fire reaches the ridge grass and the wind holds northeast, it can cross the road before dark. She knew this. She had known it before he said it. The fence you just built is the first thing it reaches if it crosses the road. Yes. He was already looking at Frank. Wet sacks. Everything in the wagon bed that holds water. Ruth Alcott was at the porch. I have blankets, she said, and she was already going back inside before she had finished the sentence. Clara went to the barn for the burlap sacks she kept for grain storage, 8 of them, stiff with use. She took them to the water trough. She took them to the coffice and pushed them under the surface one at a time with both hands, holding each one down until the bubbling stopped and the burlap had absorbed what it could hold. The water came off her hands cold enough to ache, and she did not think about her hands. She thought about the sacks and the weight of them and how many she could carry, and how long a wet sack stayed wet when you were carrying it smide across open ground. Frank took half of them from her before she could carry them to the wagon. He carried 4 in each hand by the corners, the water running down his coat sleeves, and put them in the wagon bed without any commentary on the redistribution of the load. Ruth came out with the blankets, 3 of them wool, old but dense. She had them rolled tight. Aaron took them. Roy was already at the wagon seat with the reins, which surprised Clara for half a second before she recognized that Roy's moving to the reins was Roy's calibration, the same way Frank's reorganizing of the wagon bed was Frank's calibration, each man going to the place where his particular efficiency was most needed. Holt looked at Clara. She already had her apron off and rolled around 2 of the wet sacks. Do not say I should stay. Something in his expression shifted, not surprise, which it was not. Not agreement, exactly. The expression of a man who had made a calculation and revised it in real time. Stay to the south of the fire. If it turns, go east, not west. The east ground has less grass. I know the ground, Clara said. I know you do. He said they went. The drive to the Pruett claim was 12 minutes by wagon, which was not fast enough and was as fast as the road allowed, the road being the dirt track that served the south face of Juniper Ridge and had ruts in it from spring runoff that had dried into permanent irregularities. Roy drove without pushing the horses past what the road would bear, which was the judgment of a man who had driven enough bad roads to know that the horse that broke a leg in a rut arrived nowhere. The smoke column was visible the whole way, growing as they closed the distance, shifting slightly in the wind. They came around the last bend, and the fire was ahead of them. It had been moving northeast for perhaps 40 minutes, following the dry grass on the lower slope of the Pruett claim, and it had covered maybe 300 yards since it started, which was not fast but was not slow either, and the wind had not dropped. Clara could feel the heat of it from 50 yards away, the specific dry thermal radiance of grass fire rather than the wet heat of wood fire, and she could hear it, the low collective rushing sound of combustion moving forward through dry material, present and continuous, like water move in a fast, shallow creek. And then she saw what was at the center of the Pruett claim. She had known, from Ruth's description, and from the newspaper page in her pocket, that this land was not what it claimed to be. She had known there was no real habitation, no meaningful cultivation, no evidence of a life being lived. But knowing a thing as information, and seeing it as landscape were different, and what she saw from the wagon was the landscape of the difference. No house. A shed with boards that had gone to gray, leaning the way a structure leans when the people who built it did not expect to have to care about it for long. A section of ground that had been turned once, in a strip too narrow for honest cultivation, the kind of turning that put a line on a map, without putting anything in the ground. and in the center of the claim, solid and substantial, and out of all proportion to everything else on the land, a hayrick. A full hayrick, stacked and shaped with genuine care. The hay baled, and the bales set with the precision of a man who understood hay, even if he understood nothing else about farming, wrapped at the top with canvas, lashed against weather. Clara looked at the hayrick and understood it immediately. It was large enough to represent a winter's worth of feed for a substantial herd. There was no herd. There had never been a herd on this land. She would have bet what little she had on it, because the grass around the claim was the grass of land not grazed, tall and dense, and standing the way grass stood when no animal had touched it for years. The hayrick was not feed for cattle that lived here. It was a prop. It was the specific piece of evidence that a particular kind of examiner, given a particular kind of look at a claim, might interpret as proof of agricultural intent, winter preparation for a herd that would be brought in just before inspection and removed just after. The fire was 40 yards from the hayrick and moving toward it. If the hayrick burned, the fire would be 20 feet tall and the burning material would go airborne in the wind, and it would cross the road and reach the new fence in less than an hour. Holt was out of the wagon before it stopped moving, which was a thing Clara did not entirely process until she was also out of the wagon, her boots hitting the ground while it was still rolling slightly, and she had a wet sack in each hand, and she was moving toward the fire. The work of beating back a grass fire was not complicated. It was only exhausting. You moved toward the edge of the active burn, not the center, and you beat the advancing edge with whatever you had, wet sacks being optimal, and you moved along the edge as it moved, staying with it, denying it the grass ahead by breaking the contact between flame and fuel, and you did this continuously, until either the fuel ran out, or the wind dropped, or you had made enough break in the line that the fire ran out of lateral options and began to die back on itself. Clara had fought 2 grass fires in her years on Juniper Ridge, one in the 3rd summer, small and caught early, and one in the 6th summer that had taken an outbuilding before 3 neighboring men had helped her get ahead of it. She knew what she was doing. She was not fast, and she was not the strongest person on the line, but she knew what she was doing, and knowing what you were doing was worth more than speed at the edges of a fire. Holt was on her left working the sack in a wide sweeping arc, moving faster than she was but not faster than the fire required him to move, which was the right pace, because moving faster than necessary in firework was how people ended up on the wrong side of what they were trying to contain. Aaron was beyond him, working with one of Ruth's blankets, and the blanket was heavier than a sack and more effective for wide area beat, but harder to manage with one hand, and Aaron was managing it with both, his coat gray with ash at the sleeves. Roy and Jesse were working the south side, cutting the fire off from the road before it could reach the grass on the verge, which was the tactical decision Clara would have made, and she was glad someone had made it without being told, because she had not been in a position to tell anyone anything. She had been moving toward the hayrick. The hayrick was the priority. She understood this in her bones even as she worked the east edge of the fire line. If the hayrick went, the fight changed. The hayrick going was not just a tactical problem. It was the specific material evidence of what Silas Pruett had been doing with this land and others, and while you treat them with kindness, and while some part of Clara's mind that she set aside in order to function noted that there was a certain satisfaction in the idea of that evidence burning, the larger part of her mind that was focused on Thursday morning noted that the fire that took the hayrick would take her fence, and the fence was not symbolic. Frank and Cord had gone straight to the hayrick. She saw it when the smoke shifted for a moment and gave her 30 yards of visibility. Frank was using a wet sack on the grass, immediately around the base of the rick, clearing the fuel source from the base before the fire reached it. And Cord was on his knees at the south face of the rick, doing something she could not immediately see through the smoke, and then the smoke closed again, and she was back to the 8 feet of fire edge directly in front of her. The work had a sound. The slap of wet burlap on burning grass, the hiss of steam, the continuous low rush of the fire itself, the occasional shout of a direction or a warning, and underneath all of it the wind, steady and unhelpful, pushing the fire where it wanted to go, which was north. She stopped hearing the individual sounds after a while. They became the texture of the work rather than information, and she moved in it the way she moved in the sound of the mattock striking hard ground that morning, not listening exactly, present to it, reading it without translating it. It was in this state, 20 minutes in, that she became aware Holt Granger was beside her. He had left the hayrick and come to the fire line, and he was working beside her with a wet blanket folded double, beating the edge in the same direction she was working. Would you treat them with kindness? And the blanket was more effective than her sack, but he was using it differently than Aaron had. Not swinging it, but pressing it flat and dragging it, smothering rather than beating, which worked on the lower-lying fire at the grass roots rather than the tops. Would you treat them with kindness? His wrapped hands were working the blanket against the tuck and fold of the ground, and she could see the effort it was costing him to maintain the grip, the way his forearms were set, the compensation in his shoulders. And she wanted to say something, and did not say anything because the fire was what it was, and what she could say could wait, and the fire could not. The smoke shifted again, and she looked north toward the hayrick, and saw that Frank had made a cleared circle around it, bare earth 10 feet wide. And the fire was reaching the cleared earth and losing momentum there, the flame dropping as it hit ground with no fuel, burning out at the edge and advancing no further. The hayrick stood. She kept working. It was 35 minutes from when they left the wagon to when the fire line was broken. Not eliminated, not fully out, smoldering at the edges where the grass had burned through to the roots, but broken. The forward advance stopped, the road not reached, the fence not threatened. Clara stood in the position she had been working, the wet sack in her hands now more ash than wet, and looked at what they had done. The Pruett claim lay around her in the specific quiet of a place that has just been through something. The burned section was perhaps 4 acres, the grass gone to black and gray, the soil underneath pale where it showed through. The hayrick stood at the center of the cleared circle Frank had cut, intact. The canvas cover darkened at the edges with heat and ash. The shed at the far end of the claim was untouched. The strip of turned ground was untouched. There was nothing else to touch. That was the thing. Standing in the post-fire stillness of the Pruett claim, breathing air that tasted of ash and dry grass, Clara could see the whole of what this land was and was not. She had known it as description, as information provided by Ruth's newspaper page. But description and presence were different, and she was present to it now, standing in the middle of the evidence. No house anyone could live in. No livestock. No cultivation that extended past the strip wide enough to photograph. And the hayrick, perfect and proportioned and cared for, the single piece of the claim that had received real attention, because the hayrick was the piece that was meant to be seen. Aaron came up beside her. She noticed his right hand when he shifted the rolled blanket to his left arm. The back of his hand, the knuckle area and the skin between the first 2 fingers, was red in the way that meant a thermal insult that had not broken the skin yet but would blister by morning. He held it slightly away from his side without seeming aware he was doing it. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had completed a task and was accounting for the completion, not for the injury. She went to him. She did not ask. She took the rolled blanket from his left arm and put it under her own, and took his right hand by the wrist, not the hand itself, and looked at the burn. He did not pull away. He stood still in the way of a man who had not expected this and was not sure what response was indicated. His face was ash-gray with the dust of it, his canvas coat blackened at both sleeves. Would you treat them with kindness? And under the ash she could see that he was perhaps 24 and had probably been doing a man's work since he was much younger than that, and had learned in doing it to hold certain things, including his right hand currently, at a distance from his own attention. "I have clean cloth in my apron pocket," Clara said. The apron was tied at her waist under the duster she had put on before they left, and she reached inside the duster to the pocket without letting go of his wrist. She had a long strip of cotton cloth there, kept from an old shirt, the kind of thing a person who worked alone kept available because there was no one else to go for supplies. She wrapped the burn loosely. He watched her do it without comment. "You should have said something," she said. She kept her voice level so it was not a criticism, only information. He looked at the wrapped hand. It did not seem like the time. She tied off the end of the cloth. There is always time to say something hurts. He was quiet for a moment. My mother used to say that. He said it simply, the way a person says a thing they are not sure they were going to say until they said it, with no particular elaboration afterward. Clara released his wrist. He brought the hand in against his side. She looked away from him with kindness. She looked away from him toward the hayrick, because the alternative was continuing a conversation that had gone somewhere she had not anticipated, and she was still doing the fire math in her head, and the fire math required attention. The hayrick had survived. The road had not been reached. The fence would stand. The fence. Her fence. Would you treat them with kindness? Built this morning on a claim that belonged to her, for as long as she could demonstrate it belonged to her, which was a condition she was still living inside. And kindness? And standing on someone else's land, looking at the evidence of how she came to be in this condition, was producing a quality of feeling that she did not have a clean word for, not anger. Something older than anger, the particular feeling of a person who has been trying to do a right thing in a system designed to make right things difficult, who sees for the first time from the outside the full shape of what has been making it difficult. Holt was looking at the hayrick. She walked to where he was standing. He had his hat off, which he seemed to do when he was thinking rather than talking, as if the hat was for presentation, and the thinking required something uncovered. His face was as ash-dark as Aaron's. He had a burn of his own. Across the back of his left hand that he had not said anything about, she could see the red of it from 6 feet away. That rick is winter feed for an operation that has never run a single animal on this ground, she said. Someone baled and stacked it and covered it for an examiner to see. Yes. He put his hat back on. If it burned, the smoke would have crossed the road and the examiner would have found scorched fence posts on Thursday morning. Yes. So we saved the evidence of the fraud to protect the fence he was trying to destroy. He looked at her. That is one way to describe it. She let the silence sit. There were other ways to describe it, and she was aware of all of them, and she chose none of them, because the alternatives were satisfying to think and useless to say. Roy and Jesse were at the wagon. Frank was clearing the last of the cut grass at the base of the hayrick, with methodical attention to detail that suggested he had decided the job was not done until it was done completely, regardless of the fact that the fire was out. Cord was walking the perimeter of the burned section, moving slowly, reading the edges the way you read a finished piece of work to confirm it was finished. Holt took a long breath. Let it out. We need to get back to the fence. Clara looked at the position of the sun. 2.5 hours until dark, maybe 3. The fence had 200 yards remaining when they left. It was possible. Not comfortable, but possible. They went back. The ride back was quieter than the ride out, which was the quiet of people who have done something physically demanding together and have not yet processed it into language. Aaron's burned hand was visible on his knee. Frank had a long gray smear of ash down the front of his wool coat that he appeared unaware of. Clara sat on the wagon bench beside Roy and watched the ridge road come back toward them, and thought about the hayrick and about the fence and about Thursday morning and about the 19 families and about the fact that somewhere in Cedarville or Alturas, Silas Pruett was not at that moment thinking about her at all. She was thinking about him. She was thinking about him with a clarity that she recognized, with a clarities as the clarity that came from understanding something fully rather than partially. She had spent 3 weeks thinking about the contest and the letter and the fence and the northeast corner and the deadline. Would you treat them with kindness? She had not been thinking about what it meant that a man had made a profession of this. 19 families was not a mistake or an opportunism. It was a system. It was a system that had been refined over enough iterations that Pruett knew exactly how much he could take, and from whom and when. The way a person knew their own land in their muscles after enough seasons. Ruth Alcott was in the yard when the wagon came back. She had stayed. Clara had not expected this and was aware of a warmth that was not complicated and did not require examination. "All right?" Ruth asked as Clara climbed down. "All right," Clara said. Ruth looked at the soot on her coat and the wet burlap in her hands, and at Aaron's wrapped hand as he came around the wagon. She did not comment on any of it. I put the coffee pot on. The beans are still warm. They ate in the yard in the last of the afternoon light, not sitting but standing and moving. The informality of people with somewhere still to be. The fence treat them with kindness. The fence needed closing and the light was going, and there was no version of events in which they sat down for a meal before the fence was closed. But Frank handed out the cornbread from the pan that Ruth had wrapped in cloth, and it went down the line in both directions, the way water moved between Roy and the work sites, without commentary on its own passage. Holt finished his piece standing at the edge of the yard, looking north at the fence line. Clara came and stood beside him, and ate her own piece and looked at the same section of fence. 200 yards, he said. Less. Roy was moving when we left. Good. He folded the cloth the cornbread had come in and handed it back toward the group behind him without looking. Someone took it. The wind is dropping. It was dropping. The northeast blow had been losing force since they got back from the fire, and the flag on the barn gable, which was a strip of red cotton Clara had tied there to read the wind, was moving only lazily. Dropping wind at the end of a September day on the ridge was standard, and she had been counting on it. "We will finish before dark," Holt said. Not a question, not a reassurance, a determination, which was a different thing. "We will finish before dark," Clara agreed. She meant it. Would you treat them with kindness? She was aware as she said it that she was saying it differently than she had meant things since Thomas died, which was to say she was saying it with the weight of other people in it. Would you treat them with kindness? The weight of 8 more people who had already worked half a day for her, and fought a fire that was not their fire, and were going to string 200 yards of wire in the last light, because that was what the situation required. She handed her coffee cup to Ruth and went back to the fence line. The last 200 yards went differently than the first. The ground was softer, as Holt had said it would be, and Aaron drove posts at a pace that was noticeably faster than the morning work, the auger going into the ground with a regularity that was almost musical. The thunk of the post set, the next hole thunk, the next. Roy and Jesse followed close behind him. The wire stretcher moving in short, efficient pulls, the staple gun behind that, the wire going taut in sections of 20 yards, and then the next section, and the next. Cord worked beside Clara for the last 100 yards. He was doing the staking of the intermediate brace wires. Would you treat them with kindness? The diagonal supports that kept the line posts from leaning under tension. And he had developed a technique for the work that used the weight of his forearms rather than the grip of his fingers, rocking his whole body slightly to generate the torque that the work required. It was not the technique anyone had taught him. It was the technique he had worked out for the specific limitation he was working within, and it was efficient in the way that solutions developed under constraint are sometimes more efficient than solutions developed without it. Clara said nothing about the technique. She handed him the wire lengths when he needed them and cleared the cut ends as he finished and watched the bracing go in without making it into a thing it did not need to be. "You are good at not commenting," Cord said. "I have had 2 years of practice at not saying things that do not need to be said," Clara said. He looked at her. The pale gray eyes had a quality of attention that she had noted in Holt and that she was coming to understand was a family characteristic, or a learned characteristic, of a group of people who had spent a long time working in close proximity and had developed through it a way of listening that went deeper than the words. That is a long time for something that does not come naturally to most people. "It does not come naturally to me either," she said. "I just got enough practice." He went back to the brace wire. She handed him the next length. The sun was below the ridgeline when Aaron drove the last post. The light was the residual light of a clear western sky after sunset. Would you treat them with kindness? Still enough to work in, the kind of light that lasted on the high ground 20 minutes after you would have lost it in a valley. Roy and Jesse ran the last wire in that light, the stretcher clicking with the sound of wire under tension, and Frank went behind them with the staples, and Clara went behind Frank with the hammer seating the staples that needed one more tap, and the last staple went in at the last post at a quarter past 6 in the evening. by which time the light was more determined than bright, but was still light enough to see what they had done. The north fence line ran from corner to corner. Clara stood at the eastern end and looked the length of it. 3/4 of a mile of wire, straight and taut. The posts set true, the corner braces holding. In the dimming light the wire was barely visible, just the darkness of the posts at intervals, and the faint gleam of the wire between them, where the last sky light caught it, and the effect was of something that had always been there and had been revealed rather than built. She was aware that this was not how something worked, that it had been built. Would you treat them with kindness? That 8 men she had met 12 hours ago, and 1 man whose voice she was beginning to hear in a different register than the voices of the others, had built it in a day she had not believed could contain it. Ruth Alcott came out from the porch with 2 lanterns and hung them from the fence post nearest the yard, and the yellow kerosene light fell across the new wire in a way that made it suddenly very visible, the lines of it precise and level, and Frank and Jesse and Aaron and Roy and Cord stood at various points along the near section of it and looked at it in the lamplight with the expressions of men who had done what they came to do. Holt was standing at the far end of the completed section, 50 yards from Clara, and he turned and walked back toward her with the unhurried pace of a man who had come to a place he had planned to arrive at and was arriving at it. He stopped when he reached her, looked at the fence, looked at her. "The barn roof," he said. "Aaron and Jesse did it this afternoon while we were at the fire," Clara said. "Frank told me when we got back. They put the last course on before they came down." He looked at the barn, looked back at the fence, looked at the seeded northeast corner, which was invisible in the dark, but both of them knew where it was. Would you treat them with kindness? He was going through the list, the same way she had been going through the list since Tuesday night, the fence and the roof in the corner, checking against the requirements that were going to be examined in 36 hours. "The claim is ready," he said. "Yes," Clara said. She said it and held it for a moment. "The claim is ready. Then there is supper to deal with," he said, and the flatness of the practical following the weight of the thing. Before, it had a quality that was almost like humor, without being exactly humor, a man bringing himself back to ground from a height by stating the next necessary thing. Clara surprised herself. "The ham is not gone," she said, "and Ruth will have made something with the beans. Come inside." He followed her across the yard toward the house, and behind them, she heard the others gathering themselves, the particular sound of a group of people winding down from sustained work. Would you treat them? The lamplit windows of the house ahead of them were the warmest thing she had looked at in 2 years. She did not examine this. She went inside. She would examine it later. There was supper to deal with first. Supper was a loud thing. Not loud in the sense of disorder, but loud in the way of a house that had been quiet for 2 years suddenly containing 9 people, 9 sets of boots on the pine floor, 9 sets of elbows on or near the long table that Thomas had built in the second summer with boards he had cut himself and planed with a hand plane he had inherited from his father. A table built for the family they had expected to have, in a country where expectation and outcome sometimes rhymed. The table was large enough for 9, and Clara, in the way that suggested Thomas had planned for a life that never quite arrived, and she had spent 2 years eating alone at one end of it, and now it was full, and the sound of it was a sound she had forgotten she was missing. Ruth had extended the beans with dried corn and salt pork from Clara's larder, which Ruth had located without asking. Because Ruth's relationship to other kitchens was the relationship of a woman who believed that knowing where things were was a prerequisite to being useful, and being useful was non-negotiable. The remaining ham came out of the pan in slices that went faster than Clara had anticipated. Frank ate with the methodical attention of a man for whom a meal was primarily fuel, but he passed the cornbread to the man beside him before he took his own portion, which Clara noticed because she noticed the order in which people did things, and the order in which Frank did things was always others first, always, without apparent awareness that he was doing it. Holt sat at the far end of the table from Clara, which was where he sat, not because she had assigned it, but because he had moved to it in the way that a man moves to the end of a table when he is the one responsible for the people at it, and wants to be able to see all of them. He ate without ceremony. Would you treat them with kindness? He listened to what the men around him were saying without appearing to monitor it, which was the listening of a man who would not need to be told if something required his attention because he would already know. Clara sat at her end and ate and watched the table without appearing to watch it. Ruth sat to her left. The lamp at the center of the table gave the room a warmth that the wood stove augmented, and the pine walls held the heat the way pine walls did in enclosed spaces, and the room was the warmest it had been since before last February, which was not to kindness. Her comparison she made intentionally, but which presented itself fully formed, and she acknowledged it without dwelling on it and moved on. When the plates were clear and the coffee had gone around twice, Aaron pushed back from the table and looked at the burr fern on his hand with the expression of a man acknowledging an acquaintance he had been avoiding. He had not complained of it during supper. Clara had watched him manage the fork and the knife without making the hand into a subject, and had not made it into one herself. Would you treat them with kindness? But now that the work was done and the food was done and the evening was settling toward the specific gravity of late in a long day, the hand seemed to have decided it could be acknowledged. Clara got up and went to the tin box she kept the medical supplies in, which was on the shelf above the dry sink, and brought it to the table. She unwrapped the cotton strip she had put on the burn at the fireside and looked at what was underneath. The blister was developing as she had expected. Not severe, which was the good news. The burn, treat them with kindness, had been surface heat rather than prolonged contact, and the skin was intact, which meant the question was management rather than treatment. She cleaned it with the clean water Ruth brought from the stove, dried it, and wrapped it again with a fresh length of cloth from the tin, tighter this time for the overnight. And Aaron, treat them with kindness. And Aaron sat still through all of it with a patience that told her this was not the first time he had been managed through an injury at a table, and that the person who had done it before had known what she was doing. Holt watched from across the table. He did not watch the hand. He watched Clara's hands. She noticed. She did not indicate that she had noticed. You will need to keep it dry for 3 days, she said, tying off the bandage, and rebandage tomorrow evening. Aaron looked at the wrapped hand and then at her. Thank you, ma'am. The words were formal in the way of a man who had been taught certain forms of courtesy and maintained them regardless of context. The same way Holt maintained the hat removal, the same way Frank maintained the others first. These were not performances. Them with kindness. They were the residue of someone's deliberate effort to give these men a set of habits they could keep. She thought about that effort. Who had made it, and when and in what circumstances. And then she thought about Holt, telling her that his wife had died in 1882, which was 6 years before this evening, which meant whoever these men had been before 1882, they had become who they were now, partly in the absence of that person, partly in the presence of a man who had kept the habits she had instilled and passed them forward. She put the medical tin back on the shelf and began clearing plates. Ruth stopped her. Sit down, Clara. The plates do not clear themselves. No, but I clear them. Ruth was already stacking. Sit down. Clara sat down. This was not because Ruth told her to. Would you treat them with kindness? It was because she was tired in the specific way of a person who has been moving on purpose for 16 hours, and the purpose has been achieved and the body has decided to register the cost. She sat down and put her hands flat on the table, the pine worn smooth under her palms, and she looked at the lamp flame in the glass and let herself be still. The men were still at the table. Would you treat them with kindness? They were talking in the low register of people who have nothing left to prove to each other that day. The conversation moving the way conversation moved when the work was done, and the food was in, and the heat was up, from nothing to nothing, with occasional stops at something. Roy was telling Frank something about the ground condition near the creek crossing. Jessie was quiet in the way Jessie was always quiet, which was not absence but depth. Cord was looking at the window, at the dark glass, which was to say, he was not looking at anything. He was thinking, at whatever angle the window happened to be. Holt was looking at her, not in a way that required her to do something about it. Would you treat them with kindness? In a way that was simply happening, the way weather happened. And when she looked back at him, he did not look away in the manner of a man caught at something. He held the look for a moment, with a steadiness that was characteristic, and then he said, "When did you come to Juniper Ridge?" "The summer of 1878. She said it without calculation. "We filed the claim in the fall. Moved out in the spring of 79, with 1 wagon and 2 horses and Thomas's idea about the North Meadow grass. And the grass was good. The grass was excellent. Thomas was right about the grass." She paused. "He was right about most of it. Would you treat them with kindness? What he was wrong about, he was wrong in ways that were forgivable given what he knew at the time." Holt was quiet for a moment in the way of a man considering whether to say the next thing. Then, "My wife was right about most of it, too. What she was wrong about was wrong in ways that were forgivable, given what she knew at the time." The symmetry was not lost on either of them. Clara felt the temperature of the room change in a way that had nothing to do with the wood stove. She did not pursue the symmetry, and neither did he. They let it sit between them on the table surface the way you let a fragile thing sit on a surface where it was safe, visible, not picked up. "The examiner comes at 8, Clara said. "I will be here," Holt said. It was not an offer. Would you treat them with kindness? It was a statement of what was going to happen, delivered with the same matter-of-fact quality as everything else he said, as if the fact of his being here in the morning was not something that required deliberation. Ruth came back to the table with a fresh cup of coffee and set it in front of Clara without comment and went back to the dry sink, and Clara put both hands around the cup and let the warmth of it come up through her palms and did not say anything else for a little while. The men settled into their sleeping arrangements without drama or instruction. Cord had already established himself in the small room off the barn that Thomas had built for a hired hand they had never had the money to hire, which Cord had apparently assessed and claimed with the instinct of a man practiced at finding the workable space in any situation. Frank and Roy arranged blankets in the barn loft. Aaron took the wagon seat with a bedroll that materialized from somewhere in the wagon bed. Jesse disappeared. And Clara did not know where he slept, and did not ask in the morning because he was at breakfast, and that was what mattered. Holt slept in the wagon. She knew this because she was awake at 2 in the morning. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was something that happened to her when the day had been large enough, and she stood at the kitchen window in her nightgown, with a shawl over her shoulders, and looked out at the yard, and saw the dark mass of the wagon and the horses at the rail, and knew he was there, not asleep probably, or asleep lightly, the way a person slept when they were responsible for other people, and even in sleep did not fully release the watch. She went back to bed. She did not sleep immediately. Would you treat them with kindness? She lay in the dark room where the smell of the cotton quilt and the pine walls and the faint wood smoke from the banked stove were the specific smell of this particular place that she had been breathing for 10 years, which was the longest she had been breathing any smell in her life. Would you treat them with kindness? And she thought about Thursday morning the way she had been thinking about Thursday morning since Tuesday night, methodically, going through each element of what the examiner would see and whether it would serve. The fence, the roof, the corner, the dwelling, which was the house itself, which had been habitable throughout and was the least of her worries. Cultivation, which was the seeded corner, and the existing fields, which had been worked every season regardless of what else was not working. Enclosure, which was the fence now running corner to corner. All of it present, all of it real. Whether real was enough was the question she had stopped being able to answer from the inside of it, which was why the morning would tell her. She slept eventually, woke before the rooster, which was not unusual, and dressed in the gray flannel barn dress and the long wool coat, and went out to milk before the light was full. Holt was at the pump when she came out of the barn. He had already watered the horses. He was washing his face with the particular efficiency of a man who performed morning ablutions without a mirror and had learned to do so thoroughly anyway. He had his coat on, the canvas duster, and his hat, and he straightened up from the pump and looked at her. "Sleep," she said, because it was the reasonable question. "Some." He dried his face with the cloth he kept on his belt. "You." "Some," she said. "The coffee will be ready in 20 minutes if you want to come inside." He came inside. They had coffee in the kitchen while the house was still quiet. The two of them at opposite ends of the table that had been built for a family that never arrived. Would you treat them with kindness? And the morning light came through the east window in the thin, specific way of fall light in the mountains, diffuse and pale, and carrying less warmth than summer light but cleaner, stripped of summer's excess. Clara drank her coffee and thought about the day, and Holt drank his coffee and presumably thought about whatever Holt thought about in the quiet of early morning, which she did not know and did not ask. The examiner will walk the north line first, she said. Yes. Then the barn, then the cultivated ground, east to west, which means the northeast corner last. Yes. She turned the cup in her hands. If he is the kind of examiner who measures against the standard rather than against the intent, the corner will not pass. It is one day of tillage. Holt looked at her, across the table. What do you know about Taft? What Ruth told me, which is what the Cedarville woman told Ruth. He has been doing this work since 1866. He has approved claims that other examiners would have sent back, and sent back claims that other examiners would have approved. He is not predictable on paper, but the Cedarville woman's. He stood in her kitchen for 10 minutes after the inspection was done and she offered him coffee, and he took it, and while he was drinking it, he talked about the land, not the claim, the land. What the soil looked like under the surface, and what that told him about how it had been worked, and for how long. Holt set his cup down. A man who reads the land for the story under the story. That is what Ruth said. Then let him read it. Clara had heard him say that before. Would you treat them with kindness? She had the sense that this was something he had learned to say in a specific context, which was the context of doing what could be done, and then releasing the outcome to whatever would determine it. The particular patience of a man's, who had learned that some things were not resolvable by further effort, and that recognizing the line between what effort could change and what it could not was itself a form of competence. She was still learning where that line was. Would you treat them with kindness? She thought about it sometimes as a frontier, which was an appropriate thing to think about in this country, where the word meant the boundary between the known and the unknown, and where the right response to it was not to stop but to keep moving carefully. Ruth arrived at 7 with a pot of something she had made at her own place that morning, traveling the 2 miles in the cold dark before full light in the way Ruth traveled everywhere, which was on her own schedule, and under her own power, and without apology for either. She came through the door and set the pot on the stove, and looked at Clara, and looked at Holt, and did not comment on the fact of the two of them at the kitchen table in the early morning, because comment on that was not what the morning needed. He will be here at 8, Ruth said. He is a punctual man. The Cedarville woman said he was the most punctual man she had ever dealt with in an official capacity, which is saying something because she was married to a postmaster for 11 years. I know, Clara said. I am ready. At 7:53, which was when Clara's clock on the mantel read, they heard a single horse on the lane. Examiner Taft was a man of perhaps 55 in a black vest and a dark coat and a derby hat that looked professional in the context of his office and slightly incongruous in the context of Juniper Ridge, which was not a place that generated many derby hats. He carried a saddlebag with the satchel flap open, the corner of a thick notebook visible, and he tied his horse at the post by the gate with the practiced efficiency of a man who had tied horses at a great number of posts outside, a great number of homesteads, and had arrived at an economy of motion in doing it. He walked to where Clara stood in the yard, looked at her with the evaluating attention of someone who assessed situations rather than people, but understood that situations were made by people and that reading one required reading the other. Mrs. Bowen. He had a voice that matched his appearance, precise without being unkind. Examiner Taft. She gestured north. The fence line. He walked the north fence first. He walked it the entire length, which was 3/4 of a mile, and he did not walk it quickly. He stopped at 3 post positions and put his hand on the posts and felt the depth of them, which was a check against whether posts had been set shallow for speed. He stopped at 2 corner braces and looked at the angle of the diagonal brace wire. He put his fingers on the tension of the main wire at 4 points along the line and read the tension with the sensitivity of a man who had spent enough time around wire fencing to know what insufficient tension felt like versus adequate. Clara walked with him, not beside him, 10 yards back, at a distance that was respectful of the fact that this was his work and not hers, but close enough to answer questions if he asked them. He did not ask questions. He read the fence. Holt stayed at the yard. She had not asked him to. He had positioned himself there in the way he positioned himself places, without announcement, according to some internal calibration of where he should be, and he was leaning against the fence post by the gate when she came back with Taft, his arms crossed, his hat on, watching with the expression he wore when he was watching things, rather than participating in them, which was a full and complete attention that managed to be unobtrusive. Taft went to the barn next. He walked the perimeter of the barn before he went inside. He looked at the foundation logs, which were sound, and the sill plates, which showed weathering appropriate to a structure of the age Clara had declared when she filed. Would you treat them with kindness? He went inside and looked at the structure from the inside and looked at the stall conditions and looked at the roof from below, the new shakes of the last course, showing lighter than the older material above them, the color difference visible if you were looking for it, which he was. He stood looking at the roof for a long time. Clara's heart did what it had been doing at intervals since Tuesday, which was conduct itself in a manner she associated with structural instability. She kept her face still. This was not difficult. She had had 2 years of practice at keeping her face still through things that warranted expression. Taft looked at the shake course and then at her. The last course is recent. Yes. There was no alternative to saying yes. When? Yesterday. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually lasted. Then he looked back at the roof. He took the notebook from the satchel and wrote something. Continue. They went to the northeast corner of the cultivated ground. This was where it would resolve itself. Clara knew it and walked toward it with the knowledge sitting in her chest like a stone she had agreed to carry and had not agreed to put down. The corner was visible from 20 yards away. Would you treat them with kindness? The turned earth was dark against the dry grass of the surrounding uncultivated area, the tilled furrows distinguishable from each other in the morning light. The broadcast seed, not visible at this distance, but the pattern of the broadcast present in the evenness of the surface texture. Taft stopped at the edge of the tilled section, squatted down. This was not an action that read as casual. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the action of a man who had decided to read something at close range rather than from a distance, and he took the stance of someone who had spent enough years squatting in fields that the position was as natural to him as standing. He picked up a handful of the loose tilled earth, pressed it, smelled it. He did not speak for a moment. Clara stood 6 feet away and breathed deliberately, which was the technique she had developed for situations that required her to remain functional, while her body was trying to conduct its own separate proceedings. This ground was tilled within the last 36 hours, Taft said, still looking at the earth in his hand, not at her. Yes, Clara said. He looked at the section. The full size of it, the dimensions of the tilled area, the straightness of the furrows, the coverage of the broadcast. He stood up, brushed his hand against his coat. Mrs. Bowen, he said, and his voice had something different in it now, not softer exactly, but with a different quality than the professional precision of the earlier hour. I have been in this work for 22 years. In those 22 years, I have inspected claims in 7 counties in this state and in 3 states before this one. Would you treat them with kindness? I have seen a great many things on the ground that did not match what was on the paper and a great many things on the paper that did not match what was on the ground. Clara waited. What I have learned to read, he continued, is not whether the improvement was made at the moment I am looking at it, but whether the improvement was made by a person who intended to stay. He looked at the fence line visible to the north, looked at the barn, looked at the corner. The act requires cultivation. It does not specify when cultivation began. The stone in her chest began, cautiously, to shift. He opened his notebook, wrote at length, longer than he had written at any previous point in the inspection. The scratching of his pencil was the most significant sound she had heard since the letter arrived on Tuesday. When he finished, he looked up. Your claim meets the requirements of the act. Dwelling demonstrable. Enclosure complete. Cultivation evidenced. He closed the notebook. He held her gaze for a moment, and then did something she had not expected. He added a sentence that was not part of any form she had ever read about or heard described. A woman who seeds a corner 2 years running and seeds it again when it needs, it is a woman who plans to harvest. He tipped his hat. He walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode down the lane without looking back. Clara stood at the northeast corner of her cultivated ground in the September morning, and did not move for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she walked back, to the yard. Holt was where she had left him. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not need to say anything, and neither did he, because the answer was on her face, and he could read faces the way Taft read ground. Would you treat them with kindness? And what was on her face was the complicated and unguarded expression of a woman who has just had held a thing she was about to lose, and understood for the first time in the holding that she had never fully believed she would keep it. He approved it, she said. Not because he needed to be told, because she needed to say it aloud. I know, Holt said. Ruth came out of the house and looked at both of them, and then put her hands together in front of her once, a small contained gesture of satisfaction, and went back inside to make more coffee, because Ruth Alcott's response to all outcomes, good and uncertain and terrible, was to make coffee, and it was one of the most reliable things about her. 3 weeks passed. The letter came from Alturas on a Wednesday, who delivered them with kindness by the same postal route that had delivered the letter 3 weeks earlier, and Clara opened it at the same kitchen table in the same morning light that fell through the east window, with the same quality of early fall but different, because the light was the same, and she was not, or rather she was but differently weighted, the 3 weeks having laid something down that the 2 years before had not managed to. The contest against Bowen Place, Juniper Ridge, had been withdrawn by the contesting party. She read it once, set it on the table on top of the corner where T and C were scratched into the pine, stood at the stove and put the kettle on. Holt came in from wherever he had been, which was the barn, because he had been helping Frank repair a section of the stall partition that had gone soft at the base, and he came in the way he came into any room, without announcing himself. And he looked at the letter on the table. She told him what it said. Would you treat them with kindness? He sat down at the table and she poured him coffee and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the quiet of a house that had been contested and was no longer contested. And the quality of with kindness, and the quality of was different from every previous quiet she could remember in that kitchen, including the quiet of the months after Thomas died, because that quiet had been the silence of loss. And this quiet was something else, not the absence of sound, the presence of a particular kind of stillness that came after the resolution of something that had been unresolved for long enough to feel permanent. Ruth was right, she said finally. Holt looked at her. She said that sometimes things happen the way they should. I told her it was not a simple observation. Was she right? About the observation, not about it being simple. He drank his coffee. Outside the window the yard was visible in the late September light, the fence posts along the north visible where the line of them reached, the barn solid on with kindness, the barn solid on the south side, the cottonwood trees going yellow at the tips in the way they went yellow before the leaves fell, a slow suffusion of color that happened over days, so gradually you did not notice it was happening until it had already happened. Silas Pruett came the following week. Clara was at the garden, taking out the last of the season's plants when she heard the horse on the lane, and she stood up and turned and saw a buggy coming, a single-horse buggy, driven with a deliberateness that was not the deliberateness of someone coming to cause trouble, which she had learned in the years on Juniper Ridge to read at a distance. Trouble arrived with a different quality of speed. This was something else. Pruett, would you treat them with kindness? She recognized him from the fire, which was the only time she had seen him, and he was wearing the same gray wool vest, but the dressing was different in a way she noticed before she had processed it consciously. The watch chain was in his pocket rather than visible. The set of his posture on the buggy seat was different from the set of it when he had ridden up on the black horse and looked at his hayrick. He tied the horse at the gate and walked toward her with his hat in his hands. Both hands. Not in his hand. In his hands, cradled against his stomach in the way a man held a thing he did not know what to do with. Clara looked at him, looked at the hat, said nothing. Nothing was, in that moment, the most powerful thing she could offer. Holt had come around the corner of the barn. She was aware of him at the edge of her vision without looking at him. She heard Frank and Roy behind the barn, their voices dropping to a register she could not make out, which was the register of men who were aware that something was happening and had decided to be available but not obtrusive about it. Pruett stopped 10 feet from Clara. Would you treat them with kindness? He looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision that cost him something and has arrived at the moment of acting on it before the cost has diminished. I came to tell you something I have not told anyone in 9 years, he said. His voice was different from what it had been at the fireside. At the fireside it had been the voice of a man performing a version of himself. This was underneath that. Clara waited. I have relinquished 19 claims in this county. He said it the way you said a number that you know is a number about something larger than itself. Each one filed with the intent to sell the relinquishment to the Cascade Cattlemen's Association before the 5-year period ran out. Each one filed knowing I was going to sell it and not intending to work it or live on it. And each one I allowed, in some cases encouraged, another family to put their improvements on first, because clean improvements made the relinquishment worth more. The yard was completely still. The sound of the cottonwood leaves in the September wind, that was all. Twice I filed contest against a family whose improvements were sufficient and reported to the land office that they were not. Pruett continued. Once to clear a claim in Butte Valley. Once here. He stopped. And once against a claim on Tule Creek. 2 years ago, belonging to a man named Granger, whose 3 years of cultivation I reported as insufficient when it was sufficient. I bought the relinquishment for $40 and sold it to Cascade for $400 inside a month. Holt's voice came from behind Clara and to her left, very quiet. What was the name of the claim? Pruett turned his head toward Holt. Tule Creek, southwest section, 3 miles west of Cedarville. Silence. In the silence, Clara heard Roy's voice from behind the barn, lower, and then nothing. I never knew who jumped that claim, Holt said. Still quiet. I had the number wrong, $40. I thought it was less. But I knew the amount was small. I knew that what 3 years built was worth less than $40 to whoever bought it, and I could not tell you the name of the person who bought it until now. Pruett looked at him. I am telling you the name now. I heard it. Pruett reached inside his coat. He brought out a folded document, worn at the fold lines, in the way of paper that had been folded and unfolded many times over a long period. He held it without unfolding it. This is the Tule Creek relinquishment, he said. I have not sold it. I have had it for 2 years, and I have not sold it, and I have not been able to tell you why, until this week when I began to understand it. He crossed the remaining 10 feet to the gate post and set the document on the top of the post. Not handed it, set it, as if the transaction required a surface rather than a hand. I will write to the land office. I will state that the original contest against the Tule Creek claim was mine, and that my report of insufficient improvements was inaccurate. If the office will accept the amended statement and the original relinquishment, you can refile. The 5-year clock would restart, but the improvements already made would count towards establishment. He picked his hat up from where he had been holding it and put it on his head, slowly, the way a man put on a hat when he was not sure he had the right to put it on yet, but had decided the moment required it. That is what I can give that is worth giving. I will not ask you to call it square. Nobody called it square. The yard stayed still. Holt walked forward. He walked past Clara and past the gate post, and he picked up the document from the post and held it in his hand, not unfolding it yet. He stood 3 feet from Pruett. Clara watched his face from the side. Would you treat them with kindness? She had been learning to read him over the days since Wednesday, and what she saw was not what she would have expected before she knew him, which was to say it was not anger. Not the particular compressed fury of a man confronting the person who had cost him something irreplaceable. It was something more costly than anger. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the expression of a man who had been carrying the weight of an injustice for 2 years without knowing where to set it down, and who had just found the place, and who was in the moment of setting it down, which was not relief exactly, but the first movement toward relief. He put out his right hand. Pruett looked at the hand. He shook it. One firm contact, not prolonged. Nobody said anything else about Tule Creek that day. Not because there was nothing to say. Would you treat them with kindness? Because sometimes the thing that needs to be received has been received, and the words that come after it diminish rather than increase what has passed between people. And all of them in that yard understood this by instinct or by learning, and they let it stand without addition. Pruett left, not quickly, not reluctantly, with the pace of a man who has done the thing he came to do, and is going somewhere else now, no longer avoiding, no longer staying, simply moving forward in the direction of whatever came next. Clara watched the buggy until it reached the bend in the lane and disappeared. Then she looked at Holt. He was looking at the document in his hand, still folded. He held it with a care that was not the care of a man handling something precious, which it was not yet. Would you treat them with kindness? But the care of a man handling something that had weight beyond its physical weight, which it had. Would you treat them with kindness? The weight of 3 years of work reported as insufficient, and then the 2 years of not knowing, and now the document that meant something could be done. Lord Tatum at the land office in Alturas, Clara said. He has been there since 1881. He knew Thomas when Thomas filed. He is a fair man and he has seen things corrected before. She stopped. I can go with you, when you are ready. Holt looked up from the document. He looked at her with the directness that was characteristic, the full regard of someone who had stopped using peripheral attention for things that mattered. You have enough to manage, he said. I have the claim, she said. The claim is resolved. What I do not have is a reason to stay in Cedarville rather than ride to Alturas and speak to a man I know on behalf of someone who helped me keep what was mine. She said it plainly, not as an offer that required thanks, but as a statement of fact about what she intended to do. Quiet for a long moment. Then, all right. Ruth appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, which she had gone into at some point during the conversation with Pruett, which was Ruth managing the perimeter of a situation in the way she always managed it, being available and being out of the way at the same time. Coffee, she said, not a question. Yes, Clara said. They went inside. Would you treat them with kindness? All of them eventually, Roy and Frank coming around from behind the barn, with the studied casualness of men who had been within earshot of a significant conversation and were deciding retroactively that they had been minding their own business. Aaron came from the direction of the coop. Jesse materialized from somewhere. Cord came in last and sat at his end of the table and looked at his hands, both of them, the healed one and the scarred one, with the expression of a man taking stock. Ruth poured coffee. The kitchen filled with the steam and the smell of it and the sound of 9 people around a table that had been built for more people than had ever used it. Clara sat at her end and put her hands flat on the pine and looked at the corner where T&C were cut into the wood and thought about Thomas, which she did every day at some point, but today thought about him differently, in the way of a person who is beginning to understand that holding the past and the present simultaneously was not disloyalty to either, but the specific capacity of a person who had lived long enough for both to be real. Outside, the afternoon was going to gold. The cottonwood trees along the west side of the yard were turning in the September manner, and the fence line on the north ridge caught the light the way it caught it at this time of day, intermittently visible. A line drawn across the landscape by hands that had had no obligation to draw it, and had drawn it anyway. Clara drank her coffee. Holt had the document in his coat pocket. She could see the edge of it above the pocket line, and she was aware of it the way you were aware of things that had arrived at their right place, after being in the wrong place for too long, not with drama, with the quiet of things restored. We should go to Alturas Thursday, she said. Thursday, he agreed. Ruth looked at her coffee cup. I will come, she said, in case you need a witness to the amended statement. You have not been asked, Clara said. No, Ruth agreed pleasantly. I have decided. Frank looked at Roy. Roy looked at Jesse. Nobody said anything, which was the sound of 8 men deciding that the question of who went to Alturas on Thursday was entirely resolved without their input, and that this was fine and good and they had other things to think about. Cord was looking at the window again, the pale gray eyes on the glass, and whatever was beyond it. He had the length of rope from his coat pocket, the one he had been working the day they arrived, and his wrapped hand was moving through a sequence on it, with a fluency that had not been there on Wednesday, the motion smoother, the wrist rotation fuller. He was not watching what his hands were doing. His hands were reporting back to him. Clara watched him for a moment. He did not look up, but the corner of his mouth moved. She looked away. Outside the window the light was going. The way September light went at the end of the day, on the ridge slowly and then all at once, the gold deepening and the kindness extending from the posts of the fence line until they reached all the way to the yard, and the yard was in shadow, and only the upper section of the fence posts still held the last of the sun. Thin lines of brightness against the blue-gray of the sky going dark. She could see them from here. She had not been able to see them 3 days ago. The fence, her fence, corner to corner. The thing that had been missing for 2 years and was no longer missing. She looked at it until the light was gone. The ride you treat them with kindness. It took 4 hours on the main road, which was better than the ridge road, but still a road that had been made by repeated passage rather than deliberate construction. Would you treat them with kindness? And in October the morning off the high country, in a way that found every gap in a wool coat, and reminded a person that the season was changing whether they were ready or not. Clara wore her heavy wool coat over the brown dress, her good boots, and the bone comb that had been her mother's, which she wore on days when she needed the specific weight of it. Ruth sat beside her in the buggy. Holt rode alongside on the chestnut horse, the one with the white blaze, which he had named nothing, as far as Clara could determine, because Holt Granger was not a man who named horses, which she had decided was not the same thing as not caring about them. She had not asked him directly. She had watched him with the horse over the weeks, and she knew the difference. Lord Tatum at the Alturas land office was a man of 60, with the desk of someone who had been sitting at the same desk for a long time and had stopped seeing it. He had a manner of precise attention that reminded Clara of the way Taft had read ground, except that Tatum read documents the way Taft read soil. For the story underneath the surface of them, and he had been reading documents in this office since before Clara had filed her own claim, and had developed through the reading of them a comprehensive understanding of how the system worked and how the system was made to work against itself by people who understood it the same way he did but had different intentions. He read Pruett's amended statement twice. He read the original contest filing. He read the Tule Creek relinquishment document that Holt set on the desk without comment. He looked up at Clara, looked at Holt, looked at Ruth, who was sitting in the chair against the wall, in the way Ruth sat in rooms she had decided she belonged in, which was all rooms, with the settled authority of a woman who had been alive long enough to have earned the chair. The amended statement contradicts the original contest filing in material particulars, Tatum said. He said it the way a man stated a fact that had several implications and was giving the people in the room time to understand which implication he was addressing, which creates a question of record that the office will need to resolve. How long does resolving it take? Clara said. Under normal circumstances, 6 to 8 weeks. He looked at the Tule Creek relinquishment again, however. He set the document down. The relinquishment itself is valid on its face. The amended statement, while it contradicts the original contest, is signed and notarized and carries the same legal weight as the original. And the 5-year clock on the Granger claim ran from the original filing date, which means if the contest is retroactively invalidated, the clock continued through the contest period. He looked at Holt, which means you may already be closer to the end of the 5-year period than you think. Holt was still. The particular stillness that Clara had come to understand was not absence of response but its opposite, the stillness of a man receiving information that requires all of his attention to receive correctly. The filing date on the original Tule Creek claim was March of 1884, Holt said. The contest was filed in August of 1886. If the contest is invalidated retroactively, and the clock ran through the contest period, the 5-year period ends in March of 1889. Tatum looked at his calendar. September 1888. 5 months. 5 months, Holt agreed. Then what you need, Tatum said, setting both hands flat on the desk in the way of a man arriving at a conclusion he finds satisfactory, is to refile on Tule Creek on the basis of the original claim with an amended timeline. Produce evidence of improvements made prior to the contest, and submit the amended statement along with the original relinquishment as supporting documentation. He paused. Do you have evidence of improvements made before August 1886? 3 years of them, Holt said. 2 neighbors who saw the work done. A water cistern I dug myself that is still on the land if anyone cares to go look at it. Tatum almost smiled. It was the expression of a man who had spent 20-some years watching the system be used against the people it was meant to protect, and who occasionally, on particular days, got to see it go the other way. Would you treat them with kindness? Come back of the written account of the improvements and the names of the witnesses. I will have the amended filing prepared. Clara watched Holt's face during this exchange, and what she saw there was the slow, measured unwinding of something that had been wound very tight for a very long time. Not relief, which was too simple. The more complicated experience of a man discovering that the thing he had believed to be permanently lost was, in fact, recoverable, and that this discovery required him to revise not just his current circumstances but his understanding of the previous 2 years, which had been years lived inside the assumption of an injustice that could not be corrected. Revising that assumption was not simply good news. It was the work of reorienting a life around a different axis, and that work had a weight to it even when the direction of the reorientation was forward. Would you treat them with kindness? Ruth, the Bugsy return journey, because Clara was not paying attention to driving and Ruth was, as always, paying attention to everything. Holt rode alongside, and the road went under them in the particular way of roads in the fall, the dust different from summer dust, drier and lighter, rising in small puffs at the hooves and wheels and settling quickly in the cold air. They did not talk much on the way back. Some rides were for talking, and some were for sitting inside what had just happened, and this was the second kind. The kind where the conversation had already occurred in Tatum's office, and what remained was to carry it home and set it down somewhere it could be understood, over time. Clara looked at the ridge ahead, at the line of the land she knew, the particular silhouette of Juniper Ridge against the October sky, the way the ridge looked them with kindness, the way the ridge looked different from the approach than it looked from the inside of it, the way any place looked different when you were coming back to it than when you were leaving. Holt came to Tule Creek in October. Would you treat them with kindness? He and his brothers and cousins had been staying at Bowen Place through the weeks after the letter came, which had happened by increments, rather than by decision, the way certain things happened each day, producing a reason for the next day to follow it, until a week had passed and then another. The men working the late-season tasks of the homestead in exchange for the board that Clara had offered, and they had accepted with the same lack of ceremony that characterized most of what passed between her and Holt on the subject of practical arrangements. She did not think of it as charity, and they did not accept it as charity, which was the kind of equivalence that made an arrangement work. Tule Creek was 1.5 miles northwest across the ridge. Clara had ridden out to look at it in the second week of October, not with Holt but alone, in the early morning, before the frost had fully lifted. Would you treat them with kindness? Riding the bay mare along the ridge road and then cutting west, across the open grass on the upper slope toward the line of willows that marked the creek. She had not told anyone she was going, and had not needed to because the ridge was her range and she moved on it as she had always moved, by knowledge rather than by permission. The Tule Creek claim was 160 acres of mixed grass and timber. The creek treat them with kindness. Creek running through the south section with willows and cottonwoods along its banks. The north section rising toward the ridge in a long open slope with good southern exposure. The kind of slope that warm-aired and dried early in spring and would carry grass well into fall. There was a cistern on the west side, stone-lined. Clearly, the work of a man who had dug it with the intention of it lasting. The stones fitted without mortar, in the manner of permanent work. There was a foundation where a house had been started, whereas Beinaden, the cornerstones laid and squared. The work stopped at the level of the first course when the contest arrived, and never resumed. She sat on her horse at the edge of the cistern, and looked at the foundation, and tried to imagine the version of this land where the contest had never arrived. 3 years of work and then nothing. The neighbor who had watched the work done would be the Polson family, whose claim ran east of the creek road, who had been on Juniper Ridge since 1000. Would you treat them with kindness? And who had told Clara at a church social 2 years back that the Granger claim was the best worked new claim on the north side of the ridge. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was the kind of thing the Polsons said when they meant it, because they were not people who distributed compliments without cause. Would you treat them? She had ridden home without telling anyone where she had been, and without making any decision that she was aware of making, except that when she came back in through the gate, she had felt differently about the distance between Bowen Place and Tule Creek than she had before she went. And that different feeling was information she was not ready to do anything with yet. The refile on Tule Creek was accepted in the second week of October. Tatum sent a letter confirming the amended filing and the revised timeline, and the fact that with the retroactive invalidation of the original contest, the 5-year period would close in March of 1889, at which point the Granger claim on Tule Creek would be eligible for final patent. Holt read the letter at the kitchen table and folded it, and put it in his coat pocket, and drank the rest of his coffee without saying anything. And Clara did not say anything either, and after a while Frank came in from the barn, and looked at both of them, and went back out again. The house on Tule Creek went up in 3 weeks. She watched it go from a distance on the days she rode the ridge, and from the northeast corner of her fence line on the days she did not. Would you treat them with kindness? The frame rose fast because there were 8 men building it, and they built with the efficiency of people who had built before, and knew which decisions to make in sequence, and which could be made in parallel. The walls going up, while the foundations was still being squared. The roof framing started before the walls were fully chinked. It was a substantial house for a first year on a claim. 1 large main room with a stone fireplace, a lean-to addition off the north side for storage and equipment, a root cellar dug into the slope behind where the foundation stood on good drainage. Someone had thought about the drainage. She noted that. Holt came to Bowen Place every evening that month. Not every evening was announced. Some with kindness. Some evenings she would look up from the garden or the barn, and he would be at the fence line on the chestnut horse, watching the work she was doing with the uncomplicated attention of a man who found it natural to be in the same space. He would come in with kindness. He would come in when she went leave, when the work of the day was done at Tule Creek and the light was going. He did not stay past dark, and she did not ask him to, which was the arrangement of people managing the distance between what was and what might be, with enough care that neither of them was moving faster than was warranted. Ruth came twice a week and did not miss anything. She said very little. What she said was occasional and precise and aimed at the center of whatever she had observed, the way Ruth aimed everything, and Clara answered her with approximately the same frequency and the same precision. And this was their conversation about Holt Granger for the duration of October, which was a conversation that communicated a great deal through what it elected not to say. November came in the way. November came on the ridge with intention. The first snow fell the second week, not deep, an inch on the high ground and less in the valley. But it made the airs smell different, and it made the light different on the mornings after it fell. The world sharp-edged and clarified in the way that cold air clarified things, each element of the landscape distinct in a way that the softer light of other seasons blurred. Clara walked the north fence line in the first snow. Her boots left prints in the thin white cover along the base of the fence posts, and she walked slowly enough to look at each post, each section of wire, the corner braces, kindness. The tension of the wire in the cold, which was slightly different from the tension in the fall warmth, wire contracting with temperature. Some do you treat them with kindness? Something she had not thought about when building the fence because she had not built enough fence to think about it. She made a note of the section where the tension had pulled slightly and the post had moved a fraction, noted which way the lean was, decided it needed attention in the spring, when the ground softened enough to reset the post base. She was at the northwest with kindness. She was at the northwest corner of the fence. The corner marked the point where her land met the ridge road and turned north along the boundary toward Tuley Creek. When she heard the horse, Holt came down from the northwest, from the direction of the claim, on the chestnut horse. The snow had lightened to nothing by mid-morning, and the world was the gray-white of a November day after snow. The sky flat and the ground pale and the fence wire catching no light, because there was no direct light to catch. He rode up to the corner post and stopped. She was standing at the post. He was on the horse. They were at the exact point where her land and his land met, at a corner, which was not a thing she had been aware of when she walked out that morning, the specific geometry of it, the fact that this post was the point of contact between two claims, and that she was standing on one side of it and he was on the other. He swung down from the horse, tied it to the post, which was a thing you could do with a corner post because corner posts were built to hold things. He stood on his side of the corner. He had his hat off before she had registered that he had taken it off, both hands on the brim. He looked at her with the full direct regard she had come to understand was not the regard of a man who looked at things casually. Would you treat them with kindness? But the regard of a man who had learned that looking fully at something before speaking about it was a form of respect for both the thing and the person you were speaking to. I am standing on my land, he said. Your land is that side of the post. This is as close to even ground as I have been able to find. He paused. I have been trying to find this point for 2 months. Clara looked at the post between them. Looked at him. I do not have anything to offer you that you have not already seen, he said. You saw how I work. You saw how I stood when Pruett came. You have seen this. He looked at his own hands, the hat between them, then back at her. I am 44 years old, and I have a claim that closes in March and 8 men who know how to build things and do not need me to make their decisions for them anymore if I have something else to attend to. He stopped, started again, which was the only time she had ever heard him start again. I know what it cost you to keep this place. I know because I could not keep mine, and I know what that cost was, and I know they are not the same cost, but they are made of the same material. She did not move. The November air was still and the horses were still, and the fence post between them was perfectly still in the cold ground. I am asking you to marry me, he said. I am not asking you to decide what Thomas meant to you or what this land meant to him. I am not asking you to put anything down that you are not ready to put down. I am asking whether there is a version of what comes next that has both of us in it. Clara looked at the fence post. Would you treat them with kindness? At the wire running east and west from it, the wire that had been built in a single day by people who had not been asked to build it and had built it anyway, would you treat him? The wire that was still standing in the first snow of November and would be standing in the last snow of the following April and the April after that. She thought about what Taft had said at the northeast corner of her cultivated ground, which she had not forgotten and did not think she would forget. A woman who seeds a corner 2 years running and seeds it again when it needs it is a woman who plans to harvest. She had been planning to harvest. Would you treat them with kindness? She had been planning to harvest since Thomas died and left her 3 years short of the finish line, planning through every season of the 2 years after, planning in the specific with kindness. Specific way of a person who does not know yet what the harvest will look like, but knows that the alternative to planning is stopping, and stopping is not something she was willing to do. She looked at Holt. You built more than a fence, she said. He watched her. The day you came. You built the fence and the roof, and you turned the corner with me, and you went to the fire on land that was not yours to go to, and you came back and finished the fence in the dark. She said it the way she said things that were true, which was plainly without decoration. You did not do any of it for what I could give you in return. I know that. I know the difference. I know you know, he said. Then you know that what I am about to say is not gratitude, she said. Gratitude is for people who did not do what you did. What you did is something else, and what I feel about it is something else. He waited. Yes, Clara said. There is a version of what comes next that has both of us in it. The November air did not change. The horses did not react. The fence post stood between them the same as it had been standing. Would you treat them with kindness? But something in the quality of the moment shifted in the way that certain moments shifted when the thing they had been building toward arrived. Not with the drama of a breaking storm, but with the particular weight of a thing settling into its permanent place. He put his hat back on. He put his right hand out across the post. She took it with her right hand, the shake of it firm in the cold, the pressure of it real. Two people making an agreement, the way people in this country made agreements that mattered, with the body rather than only the voice. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he got back on his horse and rode back to Tule Creek because there was still work to do before dark, and she walked back along the fence line to the house because there was still work to do before dark. Would you treat them with kindness? And the prints of thief in the thin snow at the corner post were still visible when Ruth came by 2 hours later, on her way to the Cedarville Road. Ruth looked at the prints, looked at the house. Clara was visible through the kitchen window, moving at the stove. Ruth tied Clover at the gate and came inside, and Clara poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and Ruth sat down. They drank their coffee. Well, Ruth said. Well, Clara agreed. Ruth set her cup down. She looked at Clara with the complete attention of a woman who had been paying attention to Clara Bowen for a long time, and who had in the course of that attention developed a very precise understanding of what different qualities of quiet in her meant. The quiet that was currently present in Clara was different from every previous quality of quiet Ruth had observed, and Ruth was a woman who could read the difference. September of next year, Clara said. If the claim closes in March, there will be 6 months to get the house on Tule Creek in order. September is reasonable. September, Ruth said. She picked her cup back up, said nothing else. But her expression said what her mouth had decided to leave alone, which was that reasonable was not the word Ruth would have chosen for what Clara Bowen was doing. Would you treat them with kindness? Because reasonable was a word for things that had been carefully weighed and measured and found to be approximately correct, and what Ruth was looking at was not approximately anything. It was the specific and irreplaceable thing itself, which was a woman who had spent 2 years proving up alone and had proved it, and who had found the man who understood what proving up cost and did not ask her to pretend it had cost less, and who was going to marry him in September on land that was hers, and plant a field the following spring that would be theirs. And none of that was reasonable. All of it was necessary. The wedding was in the first week of September, 1889. The cottonwood trees in the yard were still in full leaf, the green that preceded the September gold, and the yard was full in a way it had been full only once before, on the Wednesday a year ago, when a wagon had come up the lane with 8 men in it, and everything had started to be different. The peopled them with kindness. People who came to the wedding had heard the story of that Wednesday in the intervening year, had heard it told and retold at church socials, and at the Cedarville General Store, and at the water meetings that the landholders along the ridge held twice a year, and the story had acquired, in the retelling, the particular quality of stories that were true, which was that they sounded with kindness, which was that they sounded improbable, but only if you did not know the people involved, and everyone who came to this wedding knew the people involved. Clara wore the taffeta dress she had been keeping. It was the color of creek willows in early spring, green that was almost gray, and you treat them with kindness, and she had kept it folded in the Cesar's chest at the foot of the bed since the year she bought it, waiting for what she had not been specific about but had known would be the occasion that warranted it. She wore the trout brooch at the collar, which had been Thomas with kindness, which had been Thomas's last gift, and which she wore with the particular intention of making the past present rather than absent, because she had decided, in the months since November, that the people who were gone did not become less present when new people arrived. They became differently present, and the difference was not diminishment. She had made the decision about the brooch alone, on a morning in March, when the claim on Tule's Creek had officially closed and Holt had come to tell her, Would you treat them with kindness? And she had stood in the kitchen afterward and looked at the brooch on the shelf where she kept it, and had picked it up and held it, and had understood clearly. Would you treat them with kindness? For the first time, that wearing it was not a complication of the new life, but an acknowledgement that the new life was built on the foundation of the one that had come before, and foundations were not things you removed when the house was finished. Holt wore a vest Clara had not seen before, black wool, over a white shirt with small buttons, the shirt pressed in the way of a man who had either pressed it himself or had help and was not going to say which. His hat was the Stetson, cleaned, which was the hat she had first seen him take off in the yard a year ago, and he wore it the way he wore it, which was pulled down against whatever light was present, functional, unassuming about the function. Frank read the ceremony from the small black Bible. Would you treat them with kindness? He read it with the unhurried pace of a man who understood that the words mattered, and that the pace at which they were delivered was part of what made them matter. Would you treat them with kindness? And the yard was quiet enough in the way that large groups of people went quiet when they understood something important was happening, that the words reached the back of the assembled without difficulty. Cord stood beside Holt. His hands were both visible, the right one no longer wrapped, the scarring at the knuckles, and between the fingers visible in the September light, the pale pink of healed skin against the broader weathered color of his hand. He held the ring in his palm, the small gold band that Holt had gotten made by the jeweler in Alturas in June, and he held it with the sureness of a man who had relearned his hands from the outside in and had arrived, through that relearning, at a precision he had not possessed before, a precision available only to someone who had lost the automatic and replaced it with the deliberate. When Holt put the ring on Clara's finger, she looked at it in the September light and then looked at him, and what passed between them in that look was not the particular look of a dramatic moment, which it was, but the look of two people who had arrived at a place they recognized. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was the look of people who have been moving toward the same point from different directions, and have finally understood that the point was the same. She did not cry. This was consistent. The Paulson family had come from the east side of the creek road, the Hennessy family from the south, 4 miles down, the Alcotts from Cedarville, two cousins of Ruth's who had not met Clara before, but who were Ruth's cousins, and therefore people who paid attention. Examiner Taft rode in from Alturas on the same horse he had ridden up the lane 13 months before, which Clara noticed and did not comment on, but registered as the kind of presence that meant something, a man coming to a wedding when his professional involvement in the story was concluded, which meant he was coming as a person rather than as a function. She shook his hand when he came through the yard gate. He held her hand one extra moment, which was not his usual manner as she understood it, and his expression had the quality of a man who was pleased with an outcome that he had had some small part in producing, and who was not going to say so because saying so would make it about him. Mrs. Granger, he said. The name, spoken by him, in the yard where he had walked the fence and read the soil and said the thing about the woman who seeds a corner, landed with a weight she had not anticipated. Not because she had not known the name was coming. She had known it for 9 months. She had known it for 9 months. Because his saying it in that context was the completion of a circle she had not realized was a circle when she was inside it. Ruth made the supper. Not alone. Aaron and Jessie had built 2 long tables from plank board and sawhorses in the yard, and Ruth directed the setting of them with the authority of a woman who had been directing the setting of tables for 40 years. And had lost no capacity for it, and the food came out of the kitchen in a continuous movement that suggested Ruth had begun cooking the previous day and had not fully stopped. The long tables held everyone, held more than everyone, held the extra neighbors who had come after word got around that morning, held the Cedarville postmaster and his wife who had a wagon and not a specific reason to attend but had heard the Alcott cousins talking about it at the store. There was a particular character to the gathering that Clara felt but could not immediately name. Would you treat them with kindness? And which she understood by the time the sun was going down behind the ridge in the full red and gold of an early September evening, which was the character of a community remembering what it was for. These were people who lived in the same place, who shared the same water, who shared the same road and the same exposure to the same seasons and bureaucratic machinery of the same land office, who were subject to the same risks, who had in some cases already been subject to the same kind of risk, had faced that Clara from Pruett, and who in other cases had not been subject to it yet. They had come because a woman among them had kept her land and was marrying a man who had helped her keep it, and that was a story worth eating together over. Because the alternative story, would you treat them with kindness, in which the land was lost and the corridor opened and the Cascade Association moved its cattle through the North Ridge and pressed the grass out of every adjoining claim, was a story that belonged to all of them. Holt sat beside her at the center of the table and ate without ceremony, which was the way he did everything. Would you treat them with kindness? And talked to the Paulson husband about drainage on the north slope of Tule Creek, in the way of a man for whom the practical was not a retreat from the moment but a full engagement with it, because the practical was how a life was built, and building was what he understood and what he trusted. Roy caught Clara's eye from down the table and raised his coffee cup in a small motion that was clearly a toast and equally clearly not going to be spoken aloud, because Roy was a man who conducted his more significant communications at a frequency below language, and she raised her own cup back, and that was the whole of it. Cord was at the far end of the table. He had the rope in his pocket, which she knew, because she could see the tail of it above the pocket line, and she had come to understand that this was not a nervous habit and not a nostalgic one, but something more, like the way certain people kept a smooth stone in their pocket, not because they needed it, but because the weight of it was information, the constant small proof that the hand could still feel. Would you treat them with kindness? After supper was cleared and the neighbors had begun to leave in ones and twos, and the yard went from full to half full to the familiar small number that had become, in the year since September of 1888, something that felt like a household, without any of them having named it as such. Clara walked out to the fence line, not because she needed to check it, because the fence line was where she went when she needed to be in contact with the ground truth of things, which was the specific gravity of the north line and the posts set true, and the wire holding its tension through cold and heat and the first snow and the second, and the fence treat them with kindness? The fence would hold through whatever next the way things held when they were built right by hands that had intended them to last. Holt came out behind her. She heard his boots on the dry yard and did not turn around until he was beside her. They stood at the fence line in the September evening, the party sounds of the yard behind them, the dark of the North Ridge in front, the fence invisible in the dark, except for the occasional glint of wire, where the lamplight from the house windows reached. The claim closes in March, he said. I know. And then we have 2 claims. We have 2 claims now, she said. In March we have 2 deeds. He was quiet. Then I have been thinking about the upper meadow on Tule Creek, the south-facing slope. Yes, for cattle. Not many. Enough to winter properly with the hay we put up. And in the spring the grass there comes in 2 weeks earlier than the grass here because of the exposure. I know, she said. I went to look in October. He looked at her. You went to look. I went to look, she said. I wanted to know what I was agreeing to. A pause. Not a long one. When did you decide? She thought about this honestly. The cistern, she said. The stone cistern you dug yourself. I stood at the edge of it, and I looked at how the stones were fitted, and I thought about a man who fits stones without mortar, on a claim he is not sure he is going to keep, fitting them to last anyway, because that is the only way he knows how to do a thing. She paused. That was when. He looked at the fence line. The cistern took me 11 days, he said. I dug it in June of 1885, when the ground was warm enough to work. The Paulson boy came and helped with the stone setting on the 4th and 5th day, but the digging was mine. Another pause. I thought about that cistern for 2 years after I lost the claim, not every day. But it was the thing I thought about when I thought about the claim, which tells you something about what I thought the claim meant. What did you think it meant? That a man who digs a cistern 11 days deep on land he wants to keep is the kind of man who should be able to keep it. He said it without bitterness, with the measured honesty of a man. who had worked out the distinction between what should be and what was, and had stopped confusing them, while still caring about the difference, and then finding out that the not-keeping was not because I had not dug it deep enough. No, Clara said. It was not that. The party behind them had gone quiet in the way. Parties went quiet when the evening was late, and the people who were staying were simply staying, and the people who were going had gone. Ruth's voice came from the direction of the house, talking to one of the Cedarville cousins, the specific carrying quality of Ruth's voice audible at 50 yards without the words being audible. The ring on Clara's left hand caught the distant lamplight for a moment. She looked at it, looked away. Thomas would have liked you, she said. It was not something she had planned to say. It arrived the way certain truths arrived, from below the level of decision, already formed when they reached the surface. He was a man who did things right the first time, because he understood that doing them right the first time was not perfectionism. It was just correct accounting. He would have understood you the same way. Holt did not say anything immediately. When he did, it was, "Tell me about him sometime." "Not tonight. Sometime when it is not the wedding day." "All right," she said. "I will tell you about Margaret," he said. Margaret was the name she had not heard before, his wife's name which he had not said in the months she had known him. She held it the way you held something given carefully. She would have had strong opinions about the south-facing slope on Tule Creek. She was a woman who had strong opinions about land. "Good," Clara said. "We will need those opinions." The ridge was dark ahead. The fence was there in the dark, present and unseen. The same wire, the same posts, the same tension held against the same ground it had been holding since the September morning that now stood a full year behind them. And the year between with kindness, and the year between then and this evening had been a year of a kind Clara Bowen had not anticipated, and could not have designed, and which had arrived the way the important things arrived, not according to plan, but according to the logic of a life being lived at full reach. The winter after the wedding was the coldest in 3 years on Juniper Ridge. It came hard in November and stayed, the snow deepening on the high ground and staying white through December rather than the usual mid-month melt, and the cattle on the Tule Creek claim, would you treat them with kindness? 20 head of stock that Holt had bought in October with the intention of taking them through the first winter on the new grass, needed the hay that had been put up and needed it through March. Clara learned the rhythms of Tule Creek through that winter the way she had learned the rhythms of Bowen Place in the early years, through the body rather than the mind. Would you treat them with kindness? Through repeated experience of the same conditions until the conditions became familiar, and the familiar became knowledge, and the knowledge became the particular authority that a person earned over a specific piece of ground by staying with it through its worst weather. She moved between the two claims through the winter. Not every day on both, but through the week, the mile and a half, between the two becoming familiar in the way that a route traveled regularly became familiar. Not a distance you measured, but a distance you knew, its own landmarks and footing and mood in different lights. The northwest corner post of Bowen Place on one end, the stone cistern on Tule Creek on the other. Ruth came through the winter twice a month, same as before, same schedule, same buggy, same Clover with the opinionated ears. Would you treat them with kindness? Ruth's manner toward Holt was the manner of a woman who had decided to approve of something and who expressed approval through the medium of simply including the thing in the category of things she did not need to comment on, which in Ruth's vocabulary was the highest category. Cord spent the winter on Tule Creek. His hands, both of them, had come treat them with kindness, had come through the fall and with a functionality that exceeded what the Shasta County doctor had said was possible. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was the kind of outcome that occurred when a man spent enough time working precisely within the boundary of what his hands could do, instead of grieving the boundary of what they could not. He could set fence posts in cold ground. He could manage a horse in ice. He could tie any knot in the inventory with both hands, slowly, completely right. He kept the rope in his pocket. Clara suspected he always would. Some things you carried, not because they were useful, but because they reminded you of the specific work of becoming able to do what you could do. March came and the Tule Creek claim closed, and the deed was issued by the Alturas Land Office on the 15th of the month, signed by Tatum, delivered by the regular post. Arriving on a Wednesday, the way things have arrived in Clara's life, with a preference for the middle of the week. Holt held the deed for a long time before he put it in the tin box he kept in the main room of the Tule Creek house, next to the receipt from the cistern stone purchase in June of 1885. 2 deeds. 2 claims running as one, divided by a fence line that also connected them. The northwest corner post of Bowen Place standing at the exact point where both pieces of land met at their corners. The same post where he had stood with his hat in November and asked a question. The same post where she had given an answer that she did not regret on any morning, which was all of them, including the cold ones, including the mornings when the work was harder than the day before had suggested it would be. Would you treat them with kindness? When she stood at the kitchen window and looked north at the fence and still felt, a year later, the specific quality of surprise at seeing it there. In the early spring of 1890, Clara planted the northeast wagon for the 3rd time. The winter rye had come through. She turned it under as green manure, which was the practice Thomas had used, and which she had used in every year since, and which produced, in the soil of that corner, a tilth that was visibly different from the surrounding ground, darker and more friable, the accumulated benefit of years of attention to one piece of ground. She seeded it with spring wheat this time, a change from the rye. The ground was ready for it. Holt came around the end of the barn while she was broadcasting, moving back across the section in the long sweeping motion, the morning light on the turned soil. He watched her work for a moment. Then he came and stood at the edge of the tilled section. She reached the edge, turned, swept the next row. She was not looking at him, but she was aware of him, the specific quality of presence that she had come to trow as his, unhurried and complete, and not requesting anything from her attention that the moment did not call for. "What are you planting?" he said. "Spring wheat. First time for wheat in that corner. The ground is ready for it," she said. She reached the next edge, turned. It needed the rye first. 3 years of rye before the wheat. Some things take the preparation they take. He was quiet. She swept the next row, and the next. When she reached his side of the section, she stopped, looked at him. The morning was the particular clear morning of early spring in the mountains. The sky a blue that was cold and deep, and without the heat haze that would come in June. Treat them with kindness. The fence line visible all the way to the northwest corner, post where the Tule Creek boundary met the Bowen Place boundary, and both claims acknowledged each other at a corner. "I am going to need another sack of seed for the west half," she said. "I will get it," he said. He went to the barn. She broadcast the last of the east section. "Would you treat them with kindness?" He came back with the sack over his shoulder and held it while she refilled her broadcast hand, and they moved across the remaining section together without discussing how to do it. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Him holding the sack and moving with her pace, her broadcasting in the even sweeping rhythm, the seed going into the ground that was ready to receive it. "Would you treat them with kindness?" The northeast corner of the field that had been cheatgrass when everything was at stake, and was now good tilth by 3 years of deliberate effort, was being planted in the early light of a spring morning by a woman who had proven up the claim it stood on, and the man who had helped her do it, who was now proving up his own ground, 1.5 miles northwest, who had asked her at a fence post in November whether there was a version of what came next that had both of them in it. There was. It looked like this. The wheat would come up in May. By July it would be standing. By September it would be ready to cut. Golden full in the late summer light. Would you treat them with kindness? Visible from the road in the way that the cheatgrass had once been visible from the road. The corner that an examiner had walked to, first to see what the claim was made of. The corner that would now show him, or anyone who came to look, what 3 years of intention looked like when it was given enough time to become what it had always meant to be. She seeded the last row, tied the empty sack, stood at the finished corner, and looked at the dark soil with its invisible cargo of seed, the fence line north, the barn south, the ridge above them, holding the light of the late April morning the way it held all light, indifferently and completely, the way the land held, with everything that was put into it and returned it in the form of whatever that thing had been meant to grow into. She would come back to check on it. She would come back every morning, if the morning was hers to use, which most of them were, and she would walk the fence and look at the corner and feel the specific quality of not quite believing that, then, the fence was there and the seed was in the ground and the deed was in the tin box in the Tule Creek house next to the receipt from the cistern stones. She would feel this for a long time. She had been told, by no one, but had come to understand, through the experience of it, that gratitude for the improbable did not diminish with familiarity. That a thing built in a single day by people who had no obligation to build it kept its improbability intact, regardless of how many times you walked past it. She would keep checking the fence, not because it needed it, because she had not yet finished being surprised that it was there, which was a condition she had no interest in resolving, because the surprise was the knowledge. Would you treat them with kindness? And the knowledge was the thing that made her walk out in the morning before anyone else was up, in the cold and the dark and the specific quality of the early air, to stand at the north line and confirm what she already knew, that it was hers, that it held, that some things, built right by the right hands in the one day available for building them, lasted precisely as long as they needed to last, which was longer than anyone who had not seen it burnt of in a single day would have thought possible.